Somewhere in the quiet hours of a ruined world, there is the sound of metal resting on concrete, the soft, unhurried weight of something that has outlasted nearly everything else. The wasteland remembers many things: the shape of old highways, the shadows of toppled buildings, the faint warmth of fires that burned out centuries ago. But perhaps nothing endures quite so persistently as the weapons that carried civilization through its darkest chapters, each one worn smooth by years of careful hands and harder days. Tonight we rest in the company of those quiet legends, the rifles and pistols and energy cells that became as recognizable as any landmark in the wasteland. Before your eyes grow heavy, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and share where you're watching from tonight. And let us begin at the very beginning of Fallout's most enduring armory, drifting gently into the story of a 10mm pistol and the long shadow it has cast across every game in this beloved series. The 10mm pistol arrived in the very first Fallout game in 1997, and it never really left. For nearly 3 decades of Fallout history, this simple handgun has served as the first real weapon most players ever hold, tucked into the inventory of a new survivor with no ceremony and very little explanation. Its design draws from recognizable real-world shapes without committing fully to any single reference. A pistol that feels both familiar and slightly out of time, as though it belongs to a future that never came and a past that never quite ended. That careful ambiguity is part of what makes it enduring. In Fallout 3, the 10mm pistol is given to the player's character during a birthday sequence in Vault 101, handed over by a father who understands that the world beyond the vault doors requires more than good intentions. It is a moment of quiet weight. The gun is small and practical, accurate at short range, reliable enough to carry through the capital wasteland's early hours, and heavy enough in the hand to feel like something worth holding on to. Bethesda designed it with a blocky, industrial silhouette that photographs well against ruined corridors and morning fog alike, a shape that would go on to anchor promotional materials across 3 mainline games. The 10mm pistol can be silenced in Fallout New Vegas through a modification that required a steady supply of rare components and enough patience to track them down. That silencer changed the way many players approached the Mojave entirely. Suddenly, a weapon that had felt like a starter's tool became something used by precise survivors who preferred the quiet transaction of a well-placed shot over the louder bargain of open combat. The game's sound designers gave the silenced version a distinctive soft crack that persisted in the memories of anyone who played through those desert nights. By the time Fallout 4 arrived, the 10mm had been rebuilt around an entirely new crafting system that allowed players to extend barrels, attach scopes, swap out grips, and redesign the receiver until the gun barely resembled its original form. Some players built versions that handled like a short carbine. Others kept the standard configuration untouched, preferring the original shape the way certain people prefer old photographs. Not because they are the best version of a thing, but because they are the first version. The 10mm pistol survived every reinvention of the series because it answered a question every Fallout game asks at its beginning: where does a person start? And the answer, more often than not, was here. The hunting rifle has a different kind of permanence in Fallout's world. Where the 10mm pistol speaks to beginnings, the hunting rifle speaks to distance, to the particular patience of someone who has learned to wait at the edge of things and trust their aim. It appears in Fallout 3 as a bolt-action weapon, chambered in .32 caliber, its wooden stock worn and repaired, and worn again. Its iron sights, unassuming but reliable across a modest range that suits the rolling hills and broken suburbs of the capital wasteland. What makes the hunting rifle interesting beyond its mechanical qualities is the story it tells about who carries it. In the Fallout universe, large caliber energy weapons and military-grade firearms exist in abundance, the legacy of a pre-war America that spent lavishly on its armed forces. But the hunting rifle belongs to a different inheritance, the civilian tradition of a country that placed enormous cultural weight on personal ownership of firearms, a tradition that in Fallout's alternate history survived the bombs and persisted into the wasteland centuries. The hunting rifle is carried by settlers, by wanderers, by people who never joined a faction and never found something more powerful. It is the weapon of ordinary persistence. In Fallout New Vegas, the hunting rifle was rechambered in the significantly more powerful 308 caliber and given improved iron sights that made it genuinely competitive at medium to long range, not merely a stopgap on the way to better things. The game's design encouraged players to commit to a rifle if their character's skills matched it, and the hunting rifle rewarded that commitment quietly, without fanfare. Obsidian Entertainment's designers understood that the gun's appeal was not in overwhelming power, but in its honesty. It did what it said it would do, no more, no less, and in the wasteland that kind of dependability has a value all its own. Fallout 4 expanded the hunting rifle into a full crafting platform, and players who invested in it early found themselves carrying something that could compete with dedicated sniper platforms far into the game's later hours. The modular nature of Fallout 4's weapon system meant that a hunting rifle with the right barrel and stock and receiver modifications was no longer a starting weapon. It was a statement of philosophy, a choice to build something lasting from familiar materials rather than searching endlessly for something newer. That philosophy maps quietly onto Fallout's broader themes, in ways that feel intentional even when they were probably accidental. The combat shotgun carries a heavier kind of presence. It does not ask you to be patient or precise. It asks you to be close. In Fallout 3, the combat shotgun fires 12-gauge shells in tight, punishing patterns that demolish anything within a short radius, and its sound, a deep, chambered percussion that fills enclosed spaces completely, made it one of the most memorable weapons to fire in the early games. Players who found one early, usually by taking it from a raider who had lived slightly longer than the others, often held on to it past the point of strict mechanical utility, because the experience of using it was simply satisfying in a way that numbers on a stat screen could not fully capture. The name itself carries a small history. The combat shotgun distinguishes itself from a hunting shotgun or a double-barrel model by suggesting military purpose, a weapon designed for situations where the priority is room clearing rather than accurate long-range engagement. In Fallout's lore, the pre-war military used shotguns in various configurations, and the combat variant reflects the kind of utilitarian thinking that governed weapons development in the game's alternate 20th century. Form following function, aesthetics following performance, everything built to do a specific job as efficiently as possible. Fallout New Vegas introduced a semi-automatic combat shotgun that could be pressed into a drum magazine with 50 shells, and the combination turned what had been an intense but ammunition-hungry weapon into something closer to a sustained advantage. The drum magazine's visual design was a kind of industrial confidence, a spinning cylinder of destructive potential, attached to a frame that looked like it had been manufactured in a factory that knew exactly what it was making and felt no ambivalence about it. Players who built characters around close-range combat found in the drum-fed combat shotgun something approaching completeness, a weapon that matched their intentions perfectly. By Fallout 4, the combat shotgun had been redesigned with a slightly sleeker industrial silhouette and incorporated into the crafting system with enough modification slots to satisfy nearly any preferred configuration. The drum magazine returned. A bayonet attachment was added for moments when shells ran out or enemies came too close for even a short-range weapon to be useful. The bayonet on a shotgun is an image that says something specific about the wasteland, that survival always has another layer, another contingency, another answer waiting beneath the surface for the moment when everything else runs out. The laser pistol arrived with Fallout's earliest games and carried with it the particular atmosphere of the game's retro-futuristic aesthetic. Fallout's technology did not follow the same developmental arc as the real world. Transistors were never miniaturized in the way that produced modern computers, which meant that energy weapons in this alternate history were built with vacuum tubes and pre-war engineering philosophies that prioritized raw output over elegant miniaturization. The laser pistol reflects this precisely. It is large for a pistol, built with visible capacitor housings and cooling fins, designed to look like something an engineer in the 1950s might have imagined a laser weapon should look like if they were optimistic about the future and not yet worried about the end of it. The laser pistol fires a coherent beam of light that cuts cleanly through unarmored targets and leaves a distinctive burn signature on whatever it touches. In Fallout 3, enemies killed by energy weapons could be reduced to ash piles, a visual distinction that carried a small narrative weight. There was something about it that felt unlike conventional violence, quieter in its consequences, even when louder in its execution. Players who specialized in energy weapons moved through the capital wasteland, leaving a trail of these ash piles, and some found the aesthetic more palatable than the alternatives. A small preference that said something about the character they were building, even without a single word of dialogue. The Institute laser in Fallout 4 represented an evolution of the basic laser pistol concept, fitted with the clean white polymer aesthetic of an organization that believed in the inevitability of its own vision. The Institute's weapons were distinguished from wasteland salvage by the unmistakable impression that someone had taken time with their design, that these were not improvised solutions, but manufactured certainties. Weapons from a world where quality control had survived. Carrying an Institute laser was a small visual argument about belonging to something that still cared about appearances. The Alien Blaster, which appears in several Fallout games as an extraordinarily rare energy pistol, extends the laser concept into something stranger and more delightful. In Fallout 3, it can be found near a crashed UFO at a location most players stumble across by accident during long walks across the capital wasteland. And the weapon it yields is so powerful and so visually distinctive that finding it feels like a gift from the game itself, an unexpected reward for wandering. The Alien Blaster fires blue-green bolts of energy and holds a limited ammunition supply that cannot be replenished through conventional means, which gives it the quality of a treasure that cannot last, something precious precisely because it runs out. The plasma pistol and its rifle-configured cousin occupy a different position in Fallout's energy weapon family. Where laser weapons are clean and precise, plasma weapons are more violent in their expression. They fire superheated matter that travels in visible glowing bolts, striking targets with an impact that can reduce organic enemies to quivering green pools of a substance the games call goo, a word that manages to be both scientifically suggestive and deliberately undignified. The plasma weapons have a particular reputation among longtime Fallout players for this finishing effect, and the internal community humor around it has persisted across decades of the series. The plasma pistol was developed in Fallout's lore by a company called VATS Electronics, one of the pre-war manufacturers whose catalogs formed the backbone of the Wasteland's energy weapon supply. VATS Electronics appears repeatedly in Fallout's background documentation, in terminal entries, in catalog fragments, in advertisements painted on walls that survived the bombs better than the products they promoted. The company's history is one of Fallout's quieter world-building details, a corporate ghost that haunts the wasteland through its surviving inventory, selling products that outlasted everyone who ever made a purchasing decision about them. Fallout New Vegas introduced the Plasma Defender, a more refined version of the standard plasma pistol that handled differently at close range and carried a distinctly military-issue aesthetic compared to its civilian predecessor. The distinction between military and civilian versions of weapons is one of the series' more interesting recurring design elements. In Fallout's pre-war America, weapons were consumer products as much as tools, marketed and sold and reviewed, and the divide between what the armed forces carried and what a private citizen could purchase shaped the wasteland's distribution of armaments in ways that still resonated 200 years after the bombs. Finding a military-grade weapon meant understanding something specific about where it came from and who had carried it before. Fallout 4's plasma rifle redesign generated significant discussion among longtime fans of the series. The new version departed substantially from the earlier design language, presenting a sleeker form that some found elegant and others found unfamiliar, a disagreement that itself captured something true about long-running game series and the affection that players develop for specific aesthetic choices over time. The plasma rifle's goo-producing capability remained intact, which satisfied the most fundamental expectation. The Fat Man was introduced in Fallout 3 and became one of the most immediately recognizable weapons in the series, which is perhaps understandable given that it is a personal handheld nuclear catapult. Its full designation is M42 Fat Man, a reference to one of the atomic bombs used in the Second World War, and its design philosophy is exactly as excessive as that reference suggests. It launches mini nukes, small tactical nuclear warheads that produce genuine mushroom clouds on impact, dealing damage across a wide radius and irradiating everything caught within it. The Fat Man is not a subtle weapon. It is not a weapon for thoughtful engagement. It is a weapon that announces its philosophy in its very name and delivers on that philosophy with complete sincerity. The Fat Man appears across Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4, and each version carries the same fundamental experience. The knowledge that the player is holding something that could end any individual encounter instantly, balanced by the extreme scarcity of its ammunition. Mini nukes must be found or purchased, and their rarity means that most players carry the Fat Man as a last resort rather than a primary choice. A weapon held in reserve for the moments when nothing else will do, or for experiments conducted at a safe distance from any important characters. That scarcity transforms the weapon from a simple power fantasy into something more interesting, a resource management problem wrapped around a tremendous spectacle. Fallout 4 introduced the junk jet as a spiritual cousin to the Fat Man, a weapon that launches scavenged debris at enemies with enough force to be effective at close range, powered by whatever the wasteland happens to have lying around in abundance. The junk jet is the Fat Man's philosophical opposite in some ways, where the Fat Man represents the pinnacle of pre-war weapons technology, concentrated into single-use catastrophe. The junk jet represents the improvised ingenuity of the post-war world, using garbage as ammunition, because garbage is what the world is mostly made of now. Both weapons understand something about their moment. The developer commentary on the Fat Man has, over the years, described it as a weapon designed specifically to make Fallout 3 feel different from other games, to signal clearly that this was a world with different rules, different scales of consequence, where even a single person wandering the ruins of Washington could carry something capable of rewriting the immediate geography. That design intent translated directly into one of the game's most memorable recurring moments: the first time a player fires the Fat Man and watches the landscape respond. The railway rifle is an entirely different kind of iconic, not powerful in the sense of raw damage output, but memorable in the sense that it is impossible to forget once encountered. It appears in Fallout 3 as a craftable weapon built from a combination of salvaged parts: a steam pressure tank, a surgical tubing, a fission battery, and a crutch for the stock. Its ammunition is railway spikes, metal spikes used to anchor railroad tracks, and it fires them with enough force to pin enemies to walls. This detail, the pinning of enemies to walls with a train spike, is one of Fallout's most discussed design moments, a piece of dark comedy dressed in the language of improvised engineering. The railway rifle embodies Fallout's craftwork philosophy before crafting became a formalized system. In Fallout 3, certain weapons could be built at workbenches from components gathered across the wasteland, and each one reflected a specific kind of desperation-born creativity, the understanding that in a world without factories or supply chains, a survivor with enough intelligence and enough time could build something functional from whatever the world had left behind. The railway rifle is a perfect expression of this. It uses a steam mechanism, a rubber tube, a power source, and a piece of hospital equipment, and it produces something that works well enough to stake a claim against the wasteland's difficulties. Fallout 4 reimagined the railway rifle as a weapon used by the Railroad faction, the secretive organization dedicated to freeing synthetic humans from the Institute, and gave it a new aesthetic that reflected that faction's improvised underground nature. The Railroad's version was slightly more refined than the Fallout 3 original, better maintained, and more purposefully designed, but it kept the essential absurdity of its premise intact. A gun that fires railroad hardware. That the Railroad, an organization whose identity was built around freedom and human dignity, chose a weapon assembled from industrial hardware, said something specific about the kind of people who joined it. Pragmatic idealists who built their tools from whatever the world had left discarded. The railway rifle's ammunition economy is part of its personality. Railway spikes are found in reasonable abundance across the wastelands of both Washington and the Commonwealth, which means the rifle is a practical choice for the right kind of player. Someone who pays attention to what the world has available, who notices the details of the environment, and understands how those details might be converted into advantage. That observational quality is itself a kind of characterization, a suggestion that the survivor carrying this weapon is someone who looks carefully at the ruins and sees possibility rather than only absence. The terrible shotgun is technically a unique weapon in Fallout 3, a specific named variant of the combat shotgun, with enhanced damage and a title that acknowledges its nature with something approaching honesty. It belongs to a vendor in Rivet City, one of the major settlements built on the hulk of an aircraft carrier beached in the Potomac River, and acquiring it requires either enough caps or enough moral flexibility to extract it from its owner without payment. The terrible shotgun is beloved by longtime Fallout 3 players, not only because of its performance, but because of its name, a piece of self-aware writing that understood the Fallout universe well enough to embrace its own absurdity. Fallout's unique named weapons have their own tradition within the series. Each game has populated its world with specially designated weapons that carry their own histories, their own statistics adjustments, their own reasons to be sought out. The terrible shotgun established a template that New Vegas would expand dramatically. That game gave unique weapons to almost every major faction and location, creating a landscape in which every significant place had something specific and individual to offer a player who looked carefully enough. By the time Fallout 4 arrived with its legendary weapon system, the unique weapon tradition had been democratized into randomness. Legendary weapons dropped from legendary enemies with randomized effects, producing weapons that were statistically exceptional but narratively unnamed. Some players appreciated the depth of the randomized system. Others missed the stories that named weapons carried. The terrible shotgun's name itself is worth considering. Fallout's sense of humor operates on several levels simultaneously. There is the broad satire of its political and corporate commentary, there is the dark comedy of its creature designs, and there is the quieter humor embedded in individual items and their descriptions. The terrible shotgun represents that quieter category, a weapon that describes itself with accuracy and takes no particular pride in the accuracy. In a world of grim survival and historical tragedy, a weapon that simply admits what it is carries a small, specific warmth. Lincoln's repeater is one of Fallout 3's most discussed unique weapons, and its presence in the game tells a story that extends well beyond its mechanical characteristics. It is a lever-action rifle of exceptional quality, chambered in the same caliber as the standard hunting rifle, but firing with significantly greater accuracy and stopping power, and it sits in a case inside the Museum of History in Washington, D.C., specifically in the section of that museum dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. In Fallout's timeline, the Civil War happened as it did in our own history. Lincoln remained a figure of enormous historical significance, and a weapon associated with his era rests in a museum dedicated to his legacy, waiting inside a case for any survivor patient enough to find it. The location is not incidental. Fallout 3 placed enormous weight on the geography of Washington, D.C. transforming the real city's landmarks into touchstones of a lost civilization. The Lincoln Memorial appears in the game as a location occupied by a community of escaped slaves who call themselves Freedomers, a faction whose existence connects directly to the historical Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, finding Lincoln's repeater inside a museum dedicated to that legacy. In a game where a faction called the Freedomers camps at Lincoln's monument creates a web of quiet historical meaning that rewards players who pay attention to the connections between things. The repeating rifle mechanism was among the most significant technological developments of the American Civil War era, offering a rate of fire substantially superior to the muzzle-loading weapons that had defined combat before it. In the Fallout universe, Lincoln's repeater is centuries old by the time the player finds it, maintained to a condition suggesting either extraordinary care or extraordinary luck, and it fires with a precision that the standard hunting rifle cannot match. The sound design gives it a distinctive mechanical clatter on the lever action. That small detail of auditory design ensures that using the weapon feels historically resonant without requiring any dialogue or text to establish the connection. The shishkebab deserves its own long chapter in any account of Fallout's iconic weapons, not because it is the most powerful or the most precisely designed, but because it is the most enthusiastically absurd. It is a melee weapon built from a motorcycle handbrake, a pilot light, lawnmower blades, and surgical tubing assembled into a configuration that produces a functioning flaming sword. The shishkebab is a craftable weapon in Fallout 3 and 4, and the experience of building one for the first time, gathering the components from across the wasteland and watching them assemble into something that should not work, but demonstrably does, is one of the series' purest moments of joyful creativity. The shishkebab's design philosophy represents Fallout's wasteland engineering at its most optimistic. In Fallout 3, the weapon can be built with the help of a character named VATS, a raider who has convinced himself and his followers that they are vampires, a piece of Fallout's world building that demonstrates the game's willingness to let its characters have completely idiosyncratic internal lives regardless of the apocalyptic context. The vampire raider teaches a survivor how to make a flaming motorcycle sword. The wasteland contains multitudes. In Fallout 4, the shishkebab appears as a base weapon rather than a crafted one, findable in the world as a piece of existing equipment rather than something assembled from parts. It can be modified at the weapon's workbench with different blade configurations and fuel options, and it retains its fundamental personality, a weapon that looks like it was built on a dare, tested on a dare, and carried into combat on the strength of the realization that it actually worked. The flaming aspect is not incidental. Setting enemies on fire is mechanically distinct from other damage types. And the shishkebab's fire damage stacks with perks and companion bonuses in ways that can make it genuinely competitive well into the game's later sections. The name itself is borrowed from the Middle Eastern kebab tradition, and the reference is purely tonal. The weapon's creator, whether in the fiction of Fallout 3's crafting background or in the design room at Bethesda, found the word kebab funny enough to justify using it for a flaming sword. The shishkebab appears on Fallout's merchandise, in its promotional materials, and in community art, carrying its absurd premise with a confidence that suggests everyone involved understood exactly what they were doing and felt good about it. The super sledge is one of Fallout's oldest weapons, appearing in the original 1997 game and persisting through almost every entry in the series. It is a sledgehammer equipped with a microfusion cell that powers a kinetic energy release on impact, meaning that it strikes with substantially more force than its physical mass alone would produce. The super sledge is not subtle about this. It is a very large hammer that has been made larger and more powerful through the application of technology, and it approaches its role in the wasteland with the same uncomplicated philosophy. The super sledge has been carried by super mutants across the series, with an almost territorial consistency. It is one of those weapons so closely associated with a specific enemy type that encountering one in the hands of anything else produces a small cognitive disruption. Super mutants in Fallout's world are the products of a mutagenic virus called the forced evolutionary virus, which increase their physical size and strength dramatically while generally decreasing their patience for complexity. The super sledge is the ideal weapon for this combination of characteristics. It requires strength to use effectively. It rewards strength with spectacular results. And it asks nothing of the person carrying it beyond the willingness to close distance and swing. The Brotherhood of Steel occasionally produces super sledge variants with additional technological enhancements. In some games, the weapon appears with Tesla coils attached, adding electrical damage to the already substantial kinetic impact. The Tesla enhanced variant, sometimes called the Thunder variant by players, transforms the super sledge from a simple impact weapon into something more ceremonial, a weapon that arrives with an announcement and leaves with a memory. The visual of the electrical discharge on a successful hit was memorable enough that players specifically sought out modified versions, even when base model super sledges were more readily available. In Fallout 4, the super sledge can be modified at the melee weapons workbench, with a range of options that affect both its performance and its appearance, including a spiked head that dramatically increases damage at some cost to the satisfying flat impact aesthetic of the original design. These modification choices illustrate a recurring tension in Fallout's weapon systems between optimizing for performance and preserving the aesthetic experience that made a weapon worth finding in the first place, a tension that players resolve differently depending on what they are trying to get out of the wasteland. The Pip-boy, while not a weapon in the conventional sense, occupies a central enough position in Fallout's identity that any discussion of iconic items must pause here. The Pip-boy is the personal information processor that every Fallout player character carries strapped to their wrist, serving as the game's interface for inventory management, map navigation, statistical tracking, and radio reception. It is the lens through which the player experiences every weapon they carry, every choice they make, and every piece of the wasteland they encounter. In this sense, it is the most central object in Fallout's universe, regardless of what category it belongs to. The Pip-Boy's design has evolved across the series while maintaining its essential character, a large, somewhat impractical wrist-mounted device that uses vacuum tube technology and a monochromatic green display screen to present information in the visual idiom of 1950s computing. The Model 3000 was the version carried in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. Fallout 4 introduced the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV, which added a slight update to the housing design while preserving the fundamental aesthetic. Each version looks like something a confident engineer from a retro-futuristic past, designed to be used in emergencies, and has been used continuously in every emergency since. The Pip-Boy's relationship to Fallout's weapons appears most concretely in the VATS system, the Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, which allows players to use the Pip-Boy's processing capacity to enter a slowed time mode and select specific body parts to target on enemies. VATS transforms combat in Fallout from a pure real-time engagement into something with strategic texture, allowing a player who had invested in appropriate skills to place shots with a precision that real-time aiming might not achieve. The system also generates memorable cinematic moments, the camera finding the best angle on a critical hit, the projectile traveling in slow motion toward its target, the result arriving with a visual emphasis that regular combat does not provide. The Gauss rifle represents a different branch of Fallout's weapon technology, a coil gun that uses electromagnetic acceleration to fire steel projectiles at exceptional velocity, producing damage significantly beyond what a conventional firearm of comparable size could achieve. In Fallout 3, the Gauss rifle is an extremely rare weapon associated with the Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war United States government that serves as the game's primary antagonist. Finding one in the world is an event. Having the ammunition to use it is a second, related event that requires its own planning. The Gauss rifle's fictional predecessor in Fallout's lore is associated with German engineering in the game's alternate history, reflecting a version of the Second World War's technological race that diverged from our own in ways the games do not fully specify. This background detail gives the Gauss rifle a flavor distinct from American-manufactured weapons. It feels like something that arrived from outside the continental context of Fallout's primary settings, a foreign artifact that persisted in the wasteland because it was simply too useful to lose. In Fallout 4, the Gauss rifle is significantly more accessible, craftable, and modifiable through the standard weapons workbench system, though it remains among the more demanding weapons in terms of the components required to maintain and modify it. The projectile it fires travels with an audible crack and a slight visual distortion that sets it apart from conventional ballistic weapons, a small sensory distinction that communicates the electromagnetic propulsion mechanism without requiring any text to explain it. Players who built sniper characters often centered their builds around the Gauss rifle in Fallout 4 because it offered both the range and the per-shot damage output to make long-distance precision viable in a game where enemies could otherwise close distance very quickly. Fallout 76 introduced a charging mechanic for the Gauss rifle, requiring players to hold the fire button to build a charge before releasing the shot at maximum power, a design choice that rewarded the patience associated with a long-range weapon and added a tactical dimension to its use. The charge mechanic was controversial among players who preferred immediate responsiveness, but it also created a distinctive experience with the weapon that differentiated it from simply pressing a button and watching numbers appear, which has value of its own kind. The minigun has been in Fallout since the beginning, and it carries its history with the relaxed confidence of something that has never needed to justify itself. It fires 5.56mm rounds at an extremely high rate using a rotating barrel assembly that stays cool through movement rather than rest, and it produces the kind of sustained fire that turns individual bullets into a continuous argument. The minigun is associated in Fallout's world with heavy troopers, military robots, and the kind of combat situations where stopping power matters less than total output. Not the precise instrument for a precise moment, but the instrument for a moment that has already left precision behind. Brotherhood of Steel soldiers in full power armor carrying miniguns represent one of Fallout's most enduring visual compositions. The combination of medieval silhouette and industrial firepower that defines the Brotherhood's aesthetic more completely than any single design element could alone. The minigun on the shoulder of a power armor suit is a statement about a particular philosophy of survival, that enough armor and enough firepower creates a kind of security that subtler approaches cannot match. The Brotherhood genuinely believes this. Their weapons choices reflect a genuine conviction about the relationship between strength and safety that has persisted through 2 centuries of wasteland life. The minigun's weaknesses are as characteristic as its strengths. It is heavy enough to meaningfully impact a character's carrying capacity. Its ammunition consumption is high enough to require either dedicated resource management or access to reliable supply lines. It is inaccurate at long range in a way that becomes increasingly relevant as the distances it must cover grow. These limitations prevent the minigun from being the straightforward solution it might appear to be at first encounter, and they give the player relationship with it a texture that raw damage numbers cannot convey. A character who carries a minigun is a character who has made decisions about what they prioritize and what they accept, trading away. The robot Mr. Gutsy appears throughout the series, carrying a minigun as one of its mounted armaments alongside a flamethrower, and the Gutsy represents the minigun's natural conclusion in the hands of a platform that can carry its weight indefinitely, reload it automatically, and sustain the combat posture that the weapon ideally requires. Encountering a Gutsy model with its minigun active is among Fallout's more demanding early game experiences, and it established the minigun in players' memories as something that deserved respect regardless of what was carrying it. The Flamer is among the most viscerally effective weapons in any Fallout game, not because its numbers are the highest on any given chart, but because fire is psychologically compelling in a way that bullet impacts are not. The flamer projects a continuous stream of ignited fuel across short to medium distances, setting targets alight and producing the ongoing fire damage effect that persists past the initial contact. In Fallout 3, the flamer was associated with Talon Company mercenaries, among others, and encountering it for the first time in their hands was an experience that communicated the weapon's intent more clearly than any description could. The pre-war military used flamethrowers in the Fallout universe's extended conflicts with China, and the flamer found across the post-war wasteland represents the survival of that military equipment through 2 centuries without adequate maintenance, repaired and repaired again until the original components are more concept than hardware. This maintenance history is implied by the weapon's condition systems in early games. A flamer in poor condition performs much worse than one that has been kept up, and the degree of effort required to maintain a condition-sensitive weapon made players more aware of the objects they carried as things that required attention rather than simply tools to be picked up and used. Fire as a damage type in Fallout interacts specifically with certain enemy categories. Creatures with high natural resistance to conventional ballistic damage often remain vulnerable to fire, which gives the flamer a specific ecological niche in the wasteland's combat landscape, rather than a general application. The choice to carry a flamer in addition to, or instead of a primary ballistic weapon, represents an understanding of that landscape, a recognition that the wasteland's biology has been transformed by radiation in ways that require transformed responses, that the tools of the pre-war world must be deployed thoughtfully in a post-war ecology that none of those tools were designed for. The incinerator in Fallout New Vegas represents the flamer's evolution into a projectile weapon, a device that launches burning globes of fuel rather than a continuous stream, extending the effective range of fire-based combat while sacrificing some of the sustained application quality. The incinerator found favor with players who wanted fire damage without the commitment to very close range that the standard flamer required. And it demonstrated that Fallout's weapon categories were not rigidly bounded, that a design philosophy could be applied in multiple configurations, each suited to a different preferred engagement distance. The infiltrator is a silenced pistol that appears in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta, downloadable content, assembled from alien technology and conventional components in a combination that reflects the content's core premise, that alien captives have access to technology beyond the wasteland's normal parameters. The infiltrator fires conventional 5mm rounds through a frame and suppressor assembly that incorporate alien manufacturing techniques, producing a weapon with exceptional accuracy and near silence that does not require the specialized alien ammunition that other Mothership Zeta weapons depend on. This makes it practical in a way that most alien-derived weapons are not, and practical things tend to find devoted carriers. The Mothership Zeta downloadable content itself occupies an interesting position in Fallout 3's legacy. It was the final piece of content released for the game, set almost entirely aboard an alien spacecraft rather than in the ruins of Washington, D.C., and it divided players who had spent dozens of hours in the post-apocalyptic capital wasteland. The weapons it introduced, including the infiltrator, were technically exceptional but contextually unusual, items that felt like they belonged to a different story even when used in the main game's world. The infiltrator's practicality helped it cross that boundary more successfully than weapons that depended on alien energy cells, and it remained a popular choice for players building stealth-oriented characters. The combat knife has appeared in every mainline Fallout game since the beginning, and its persistence is a small lesson in the nature of essential tools. It is a fixed-blade knife with a serrated spine and a grip optimized for utility rather than ceremony, the kind of object that a scavenging survivor might carry as a backup weapon, rather than a primary choice, something to fall back on in the moments when everything else has been expended. In the early Fallout games, it operated within the melee weapon system with modest damage statistics and an animation that communicated the knife's nature accurately: efficient, uncomfortable, immediate. The combat knife's significance in the series extends beyond its mechanical role. It is the weapon of last resort, the thing a character reaches for when circumstances have eliminated other options, and its appearance in the inventory tends to mean that a player is thinking carefully about worst-case scenarios. Fallout encourages this kind of contingency planning at a design level. Resource management is a persistent thread through every game in the series, and the combat knife's presence in that management framework is a quiet reminder that no situation has run entirely out of options, while there is still a knife in the equipment list. The Bowie knife variant that appears in Fallout New Vegas and the various serrated and modified versions that can be built in Fallout 4 demonstrate how the basic concept of a fixed blade fighting knife can be extended without losing the essential character that makes it recognizable. The combat knife, in all its variations, carries the same core identity, a tool that acknowledges the closeness of things, that commits to a range of engagement measured in feet rather than yards, that requires a willingness to be present in a moment of conflict without the distance that other weapons provide. Not everyone wants to carry a knife, but everyone understands what it means when someone does. The Ripper is a powered melee weapon, essentially a motorized blade assembly that applies a buzzing serrated edge to close-range combat. It appears in multiple Fallout games, including the original, and its sound design is one of its most persistent characteristics. The rapid mechanical buzzing of the blade motor, a sound that communicates kinetic potential before contact is made. The Ripper exists at the intersection of conventional cutting tool and improvised power tool, which places it squarely in Fallout's tradition of weapons that should not logically exist but function with complete seriousness. The Ripper's in-game description in early Fallout titles referenced its origins as an industrial cutting tool repurposed for combat applications, which is a characterization that makes excellent sense within the wasteland economy. Industrial equipment survived the bombs in many forms, and the survivors who found it did not always use it for its original purpose. In a world without new manufacturing, every object with potential utility became a potential tool for every kind of task. The Ripper as a weapon is the result of that process applied to something that already spun fast enough to be dangerous, with enough mechanical modification to direct that danger more precisely. In Fallout 4, the Ripper can be modified at the melee workbench with different blade configurations and a blood cleaner attachment that affects the weapon's appearance after combat, which is a small detail that demonstrates Bethesda's attention to the experiential texture of weapon ownership. The blood cleaner has no mechanical effect, it simply changes what the weapon looks like, and its existence acknowledges that some players want to think about these questions, about what it means to carry a weapon in a world that requires its use, about the details of maintenance and appearance that separate a tool from a possession. It is the kind of detail that does not need to exist and is better for existing. The hunting revolver from Fallout New Vegas is a single-action revolver chambered in 4570 government, an enormously powerful cartridge by handgun standards, producing stopping power well in excess of what the standard 10mm pistol or even the larger caliber revolvers of the series could match. It is a slow weapon in terms of fire rate, a deliberate weapon that requires the commitment of placing each shot carefully because the time cost of each trigger pull is not negligible. This design creates a different experience than Fallout's faster handguns, one that rewards accuracy and planning in ways that a higher capacity, faster firing weapon does not need to. The 4570 cartridge is a real-world round, with a history dating to the 19th century, where it served as the standard military cartridge for the Springfield trapdoor rifle, a weapon itself associated with the expansion of the American frontier and the conflicts that attended it. Fallout New Vegas, set in the Mojave Desert and deeply invested in the mythology of the American West, found in the hunting revolver and its ammunition a way to anchor its vision of the wasteland to that specific historical and geographic tradition. The revolver form, the frontier weight cartridge, the single action mechanism, these design choices placed New Vegas's weapons in conversation with the Western genre's visual vocabulary in ways that the game's designers understood and intended. The Ranger Sequoia is a unique variant of the hunting revolver associated with senior members of the New California Republic's Ranger Corps, the elite soldiers who serve as the NCR's most capable fighting force. It carries specific design modifications, improved iron sights, a larger grip, a polished finish, and enough mechanical improvement to be immediately distinguishable from the standard model. More importantly, encountering a Ranger Sequoia in the hands of an NCR veteran ranger during a high-level encounter communicates something specific about that enemy, that they are experienced, capable, and armed with something worth treating seriously. The weapon and its carrier become inseparable signals in that moment. The mysterious Magnum is a unique weapon in Fallout New Vegas that belongs to a character called the Lonesome Drifter, a mysterious guitar-playing wanderer encountered on the side of the highway heading north into the Mojave. The Lonesome Drifter offers the player a side quest, and completing it successfully yields the mysterious Magnum, a revolver with a red tasseled grip and a musical tone that plays when it is drawn from the holster. The holster music is a small melodic phrase in the style of a Western film score, which exists for no mechanical reason whatsoever. It is pure characterization, a detail that says something specific about the Lonesome Drifter, and by extension, about the player character who takes the weapon for their own. The musical holster is one of Fallout New Vegas's most beloved specific details, appearing in discussions of the game's design years and decades after its release as an example of the kind of thing Obsidian Entertainment did exceptionally well, finding ways to give individual objects narrative texture that did not require quest markers or extended dialogue to deliver. The mysterious Magnum's music plays every time it is drawn, which means that a player who carried it through the main quest line heard that small Western melody thousands of times, associating it with the moment before each of those encounters, building an emotional connection to a piece of writing that takes perhaps 3 seconds to experience. The broader category of unique weapons in New Vegas follows this principle with consistency. The Lucky, a unique .38 special revolver found in Prim's Casino. The Medicine Stick, a unique brush gun sold by the arms merchant Samuel at the 188 Trading Post. The Ranger's Sequoia belonging to the NCR's most senior soldiers. Each of these weapons carries its own specific character, its own reason to be sought out, its own small story attached to the mechanical fact of its existence. This density of meaningful unique items gives New Vegas a texture that no amount of procedurally generated content can fully replicate. The Tesla cannon appears in Fallout 3's Broken Steel downloadable content and represents the large-scale application of the energy weapon principles that the laser and plasma rifles expressed in smaller configurations. It fires an arc of electricity capable of jumping between nearby targets, dealing electrical damage to multiple enemies simultaneously, and its visual effect is among the most dramatic in the base game or its expansions. The Tesla cannon is a weapon that belongs to the scale of Broken Steel's final conflicts, designed for situations where individual target acquisition has given way to the management of groups of heavily armed and armored enemies. Situations that the base game's encounters did not consistently require, but the expansion created specifically to justify the Tesla cannon's existence. The weapon's lore connects to Tesla Industries, one of Fallout's fictional pre-war corporations, whose legacy persisted in various technological forms across the wasteland. The Tesla name in Fallout carries the same association it carries in real-world history. Nikola Tesla, the historical electrical engineer whose work on alternating current and wireless transmission became associated in the cultural imagination with ambitious electrical experimentation that reached towards something beyond the practical. Fallout borrowed that association deliberately, connecting its energy weapons to a particular vision of electricity as something powerful and unpredictable and capable of exceeding the intentions of whoever first harnessed it. The Tesla rifle that appears in Fallout 4's Automatron downloadable content extends this design philosophy, presenting a craftable electrical weapon that can be modified into several different configurations, depending on whether the player wants tight, single-target damage or the arcing multi-target behavior of the original Tesla cannon. The automatron content itself centered on robot construction and modification, and the Tesla rifle fit that context by suggesting the kind of electrical weapon that a robot builder might design, something that understood circuitry intimately and knew how to use electricity as precisely as a tool rather than simply releasing it as a discharge. The junk jet deserves a dedicated discussion beyond its earlier mention alongside the Fat Man, because its particular identity within Fallout 4 is rich enough to warrant its own exploration. Found in the ArcJet Systems building during a Brotherhood of Steel mission, the junk jet is a pneumatic launcher that uses compressed air to fire scavenged materials at enemies with enough force to be genuinely damaging. It accepts any junk item as ammunition: desk fans, coffee cups, pencils, office chairs, plungers, beer bottles, welding goggles, whatever the player's inventory contains in abundance, and fires them as projectiles without discrimination. The junk jet is a weapon for players who are drowning in scavenged debris. Fallout 4's world is extraordinarily dense with collectible objects. Every location contains dozens of items that contribute crafting materials when broken down, and players who explore comprehensively tend to accumulate enormous quantities of specific low-value items. The junk jet transforms this surplus from an inventory management problem into a resource, converting pencils and coffee mugs and telephone handsets into projectiles that deal damage proportional to their weight. A heavy item deals more damage than a light item. A tin can deals less damage than a typewriter. The junk jet's design philosophy is perhaps the most Fallout-specific of any weapon in the series. It takes the most characteristic activity of the games, picking up everything that might be useful from every location you visit, and makes that activity itself a form of combat preparation. Every pencil you pick up is a piece of future ammunition. Every coffee cup is a potential weapon. The junk jet argues that the wasteland's abundance of useless things is itself a kind of wealth if you carry the right tool for converting it, which is a statement that Fallout's world has been making since 1997 in slightly different forms. The flare gun is not a traditional combat weapon, but its appearances in Fallout 4 and Fallout 76 give it a specific role in those games' mechanical landscape that merits inclusion here. The flare gun fires illuminating signals that call Minutemen reinforcements in Fallout 4, serving as a communication tool rather than a damage-dealing weapon. A gun whose ammunition is a request for help rather than an attempt to harm. This inversion of the weapon metaphor is subtle but genuine. Carrying a flare gun is carrying a kind of optimism about the social structures you have built, a belief that if you fire it, someone will come. The Minutemen faction in Fallout 4 is explicitly built around mutual aid and community support. The idea that individual settlements are stronger collectively than separately, that a survivor's investment in the Commonwealth's social fabric will pay dividends in exactly these moments when the gun that saves you is not one that causes damage, but one that calls the people who can. The flare gun's existence in the game is a small argument for this philosophy, a mechanical implementation of the idea that building relationships has practical survival value in a world where it might be tempting to go it alone. Fallout 76 uses signal flares in a slightly different context, with players in the online game able to coordinate with each other and signal positions across the Appalachian map. The essential function is similar, a weapon whose projectile is a communication rather than a projectile. A gun whose purpose is not to end a situation, but to change the social configuration of the people addressing it. In a series that has spent decades thinking carefully about the relationship between weapons and the communities that carry them, the flare gun represents perhaps the most optimistic answer to the question of what a gun is for. The lever-action rifle appears in Fallout 4's Far Harbor downloadable content and brings with it the specific atmosphere of the main island setting. Isolated, fog-bound, old, carrying the weight of a community that has existed for a long time by making do with what is available. The lever action mechanism, which dates in real-world firearm history to the 19th century, suits that setting naturally. It is a design that has proven itself over an extraordinary span of time, refined through iterations until it reached a form that required very little further improvement. The Far Harbor lever action carries all of this historical weight into Fallout's world. The Far Harbor content as a whole represents one of the most tonally distinctive pieces of Fallout 4's extended experience. It departs from the Commonwealth's urban ruins and open highway landscapes in favor of dense forest, coastal cliffs, and perpetual fog that limits visibility and creates a specific kind of navigational intimacy with the environment. The weapons found there, including the lever-action rifle, carry this tonal distinction. They feel like they belong to a specific place rather than to the general wasteland, and that sense of belonging gives them a character that weapons found across more generic landscapes sometimes lack. The lever action's mechanical characteristic, the need to work the lever between shots, reloading from a tubular magazine beneath the barrel, creates a shooting rhythm different from semi-automatic or bolt-action weapons. Players who built characters around the lever action developed a sense of that rhythm, learning to anticipate the reload requirement and plan their shots accordingly, which is a kind of relationship with a weapon that only develops through extended use. The Far Harbor content provided enough concentrated encounter opportunities to develop this relationship, and players who emerged from it with the lever action in their preferred loadout carried it with a specific kind of earned familiarity. The harpoon gun from Fallout 4's Far Harbor content operates as a heavy-ranged weapon that fires large harpoon projectiles with enough force to pin lighter enemies to surfaces. A maritime weapon in a maritime setting, another example of Far Harbor's careful attention to the logic of its specific geography. The harpoon as a weapon predates firearms by millennia, developed for hunting large aquatic animals from boats and requiring substantial physical force to operate in its traditional form. The harpoon gun replaces that physical force with pneumatic or explosive propulsion depending on the ammunition type, maintaining the essential design logic while updating its practicality for combat applications. The pin-to-surface mechanic, shared with the railway rifle discussed earlier, produces a distinctive visual outcome that players find memorable regardless of whether they find it comfortable. An enemy literally staked in place, unable to advance, their momentum converted entirely into the evidence of a single projectile's passage. The effect is extreme enough that it has become associated specifically with the weapons that produce it, those weapons remembered partly because of the images they leave behind. Fallout's weapon design team understood that memorability requires specificity, and the harpoon's specific visual consequence is one of the series' most specific. The baton, a simple law enforcement impact weapon found throughout the Fallout series, carries its own kind of significance that has nothing to do with damage output. It is the weapon of order, of authority attempting to maintain itself in a world that has largely exhausted both concepts. Security guards in pre-war installations carry batons in the terminal entries and holotape recordings that constitute Fallout's historical record. Characters who understood their role as maintaining a specific kind of peace through the application of controlled force rather than lethal violence. The baton exists at the line between weapon and tool, designed to stop rather than end, which gives it a moral positioning unlike anything else in Fallout's armory. Finding a baton in Fallout 3 or New Vegas, carried by a raider or a slaver, or some other figure whose relationship to order is purely antagonistic, produces a small irony that the games acknowledge only quietly. A weapon designed for restraint carried by someone with no interest in restraint is itself a commentary on what happens to the tools of civilization when the civilization dissolves. The baton's job was to keep the peace. The raider carrying it is what the peace became when the structures that maintained it collapsed. That small tragedy is distributed throughout Fallout's world in 1,000 specific object histories, and the baton is one of the clearest of them. The rocket launcher from Fallout 3 is the direct ancestor of the junk jet, a craftable weapon that fired miscellaneous items as projectiles, demonstrating that the concept of ammunition as inventory was present in Fallout's design thinking from the very beginning of the Bethesda era. The rocket launcher required components including a deathclaw hand, a conductor, a fire hose nozzle, and a vacuum cleaner, assembled into a configuration that used the vacuum cleaner's suction system in reverse to propel objects at high velocity. It was simultaneously a masterpiece of wasteland engineering and a vehicle for Fallout's humor, because the objects it fired most effectively were often the most absurd items in the player's inventory. The rocket launcher's optimal ammunition was a matter of community discussion for years after Fallout 3's release. Players calculating the weight-to-damage relationship for various junk items to determine which wasteland debris served best as a ballistic projectile. Teddy bears appeared frequently in these calculations, being heavy enough to deal respectable damage while being abundant enough to accumulate in quantity. The image of a survivor firing plush toys at super mutants with a vacuum cleaner powered by a deathclaw hand is so specifically Fallout that nothing else need be said to explain the series' identity. The rocket launcher did not survive into subsequent games. The junk jet in Fallout 4 represents a more refined expression of the same concept, and the later game's crafting system made the elaborate component assembly of the rocket launcher somewhat redundant. But veterans of Fallout 3 remember the rocket launcher with particular affection, as a weapon that existed at the intersection of creativity and comedy in a way that felt genuinely liberating, a demonstration that the wasteland's abundance of useless things could be converted into advantage by someone clever enough to see the possibility. The Righteous Authority is a unique laser rifle in Fallout 4, given to the player by Paladin Dance of the Brotherhood of Steel after the completion of an early quest called Call to Arms. It carries a legendary effect that doubles the damage of critical hits, and its acquisition marks a turning point in many players' early game progression. The moment when a faction's intentions toward the player became expressed through material generosity, when a potential ally demonstrated their relationship through the gift of a weapon. The Righteous Authority is mechanically excellent. It is also a name and a piece of naming philosophy that tells you something about the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood of Steel names their equipment as they name their organizational structure, with reverence for hierarchy and a vocabulary drawn from religious tradition and military ceremony. Righteous Authority is a name that expresses something about how the Brotherhood understands itself. That authority is righteous, that the application of that authority through force is also righteous, that the weapons they carry are tools of a just order rather than simply instruments of survival. The laser rifle itself does not change based on who carries it, but the name given to one specific instance of it becomes a small philosophical document. The Sentinel's Plasma Caster, the Survivor's Special, the Last Minute, the Lorenzo's Artifact, Fallout 4 is filled with unique weapons whose names carry similar weight, each one a small story about the world that produced it and the hands it has passed through. Collecting these weapons is a form of listening to the wasteland's history, gathering the fragments of explanation that the world offers about itself in the form of exceptional objects and the names they have been given. The Spray and Pray is a unique submachine gun in Fallout 4 that deals explosive damage. Every bullet detonates on impact, dealing area of effect damage around the point of contact. It belongs to a traveling merchant named Cricket, who wanders between several settlements and carries the weapon as her most distinctive and most expensive item. Its name is a small piece of folk humor about automatic weapons and the way they are sometimes used. The technique of firing continuously in the general direction of a threat without particular attention to accuracy, relying on rate of fire and ammunition volume to compensate for the lack of precision. The Spray and Pray acknowledges this technique and endorses it through its design, making the lack of precision a feature rather than a limitation by ensuring that impacts deal area damage regardless of where exactly they land. The explosive legendary effect is among the most discussed in Fallout 4's player community. identified early in the game's life as producing exceptional results with certain weapon types and carrying the theoretical potential to become the dominant configuration for players who understood the game's damage systems deeply. The spray and pray made this effect accessible through a named vendor in a fixed location rather than through randomized legendary drops, which meant that players who knew about it could plan to acquire it rather than hoping for it to appear. A design choice that made the information about the weapon itself a form of progression, rewarding players who engaged with the game's community or its written materials. The Institute rifle is a weapon produced by the Institute, the underground scientific organization that constitutes Fallout 4's most morally complex antagonistic force, and it reflects that organization's aesthetic values with complete fidelity. The Institute's weapons are clean, white, and polymer housed, designed with the same attention to appearance that the Institute applies to everything it produces. They look like objects from a world where quality control survived, which is precisely the argument the Institute makes about itself, that it represents continuity with the best of the pre-war world, that its manufactured objects are evidence of a superior approach to existence. The Institute rifle fires blue laser bolts and deals consistent damage that scales well into the game's later sections, but its primary significance is as an object of faction identity rather than mechanical optimization. Carrying an Institute rifle, while allied with the Institute, is a form of self-expression, a declaration of affiliation expressed through equipment choice. Carrying one while opposed to the Institute is something more ambiguous: the appropriation of an enemy's technology, the use of their tools against their intentions, a small symbolic inversion that the game does not comment on, but that players perform deliberately. The Institute's relationship to its own technology is central to Fallout 4's story, and the weapons are part of that relationship. Everything the Institute makes is an expression of a philosophy about what technology is for and who deserves access to it. The Institute rifle, in the player's hands regardless of faction alignment, is a small piece of that philosophy made portable, carried through the Commonwealth, as a reminder that the most sophisticated things in this world were made by people who lived underground and believed they knew something everyone else had forgotten. The lever gun in Fallout 76 carries the lever action tradition forward into the game's Appalachian setting, where West Virginia's specific history and geography give it a grounding different from the Maine coastline or the Mojave Desert. West Virginia's mountains and forests create a landscape where close and medium-range engagement is more common than the open sightlines of the Mojave, and the lever gun's characteristics suit that landscape. It fires quickly for a lever action. Its tubular magazine holds enough rounds to address most encounters before reloading, and its aesthetic fits the region's identity as a place where the old ways of doing things persist because the conditions that made them effective in the first place never fully disappeared. Fallout 76's weapon crafting system expanded on Fallout 4's foundations with additional complexity, and the lever gun was among the weapons that benefited most from that expansion. Players who committed to building characters around it found that the fully modified version of the weapon compared favorably to more obviously powerful alternatives, which is the kind of discovery that Fallout's design teams have consistently tried to make possible. The revelation that dedication and knowledge applied to an unexpected choice can produce results that the straightforward path does not offer. The handmade rifle in Fallout 76 represents the AK pattern assault rifle design carried forward into Fallout's fictional context. A weapon visually and mechanically inspired by the Kalashnikov family of firearms that has characterized a significant portion of real-world conflict since the 1940s. In Fallout's alternate history, the handmade rifle is named for its improvised character, suggesting that it was produced outside of formal manufacturing contexts, assembled by someone with knowledge of the design and access to compatible materials. Its appearance in Appalachia connects to the region's history of small-scale manufacturing and independent mechanical culture. The AK pattern's global proliferation in the real world comes from its mechanical simplicity and durability, a design that functions reliably under adverse conditions, that can be maintained by people without specialized training, that can be manufactured in facilities without the industrial sophistication required for more precisely engineered weapons. In Fallout's world, those same qualities ensure that the handmade rifle persists in areas where the more sophisticated pre-war weapons have degraded beyond practical recovery. It is the weapon of a world that has learned to work with less, built by people who understood that a gun that works is more valuable than a gun that was once exceptional. The .44 pistol in Fallout 4 is a double-action revolver chambered in the same 44 Magnum cartridge that became culturally significant through a specific sequence of detective films in the 1970s. Films whose influence on popular conceptions of handgun power has persisted for decades. Fallout's designers were aware of this cultural history and incorporated it into the weapon's identity. The .44 pistol is presented as the most powerful conventional handgun in the game's base content, and acquiring one early carries an implicit promise about the kind of force it represents. The .44 pistol is found carried by Diamond City's mayor in an early encounter, and that placement is deliberate. The leader of the Commonwealth's largest human settlement carries the game's most powerful conventional handgun as a natural expression of their position. Power and the instruments that express it are related in Fallout's world in ways that reflect their relationship in the historical world. The person who carries the most capable tool also tends to be the person whose authority is most firmly established. And the weapon serves as a constant low-level reminder of that establishment. The .44 pistol in the mayor's holster is a small argument about how authority works in a place without formal governance structures. The broadsider is one of Fallout 4's most delightfully incongruous weapons, a naval cannon reduced to individual weapon scale, firing cannonballs at enemies through a mechanism that suggests someone found a ship's armament and asked a very specific and creative question about whether it could be made portable. It fires genuine cannonballs, spherical iron projectiles that deal significant impact damage and knock enemies back, using a black powder propellant mechanism that produces both smoke and a distinctive cannon report. The broadsider is found in the hands of the USS Constitution's robot crew, which provides it with a narrative context that transforms an otherwise inexplicable weapon into a completely sensible one given the circumstances. The USS Constitution in Fallout 4 is one of the game's most memorable locations, an 18th century sailing vessel, somehow still afloat, and crewed by robots who have spent 200 years maintaining their duties aboard a ship that has not left port because the ship is beached on top of a skyscraper. The robots running it have preserved the ship's character completely, maintaining its historical identity despite the complete absence of any context in which that identity makes sense. The broadsider that they carry and occasionally provide to allied players is an extension of this preservation, a weapon suited to its ship, carried faithfully by crew who have never questioned whether their equipment remained appropriate. The cannonball ammunition for the broadsider is heavy and rare, which means that acquiring it requires the same kind of resource management attention that all of Fallout's ammunition-intensive weapons demand. Players who chose to carry the broadsider were making a commitment to seek out cannonballs, to carry their weight, to invest in a weapon that offered the specific experience of firing a cannon at wasteland adversaries, rather than the efficient damage per ammunition ratio that optimized weapon choices generally prioritize. That commitment is itself a form of self-expression, a statement about what kind of survivor you are and what kinds of experiences you find worth pursuing. The Lorenzo's artifact gun is a unique pistol in Fallout 4 that fires a burst of telekinetic energy capable of launching enemies into the air, a weapon with no conventional ballistic mechanism, producing instead an effect that belongs to science fiction rather than military history. It belongs to a quest line involving a family named Cabot, a centuries-old man named Lorenzo who has been imprisoned in an asylum for 200 years, and an alien artifact that has granted Lorenzo both extraordinary longevity and apparent supernatural abilities. Completing the quest by releasing Lorenzo yields the weapon named for him. Completing it by keeping him imprisoned yields a different reward. The choice is genuinely difficult in the way that the best Fallout decisions are, because both sides of it have reasonable arguments that the game presents honestly. Lorenzo's artifact gun's effect, launching enemies upward with a burst of kinetic force, is mechanically effective against most enemy types and produces spectacular visual results against enemies caught near cliffs or elevated areas. But it is primarily memorable because of what it implies about the Cabot questline and the nature of the object Lorenzo possessed for so long. A weapon made from an alien artifact, producing effects that defy conventional physics, carried through the Commonwealth by a survivor who made a choice about an old man in a cell. The artifact gun is one of Fallout 4's most specifically narrative weapons, its mechanical character inseparable from the story that produced it. The cryolator is a unique weapon in Fallout 4 found in a locked case in Vault 111's Overseer's office, visible from the very beginning of the game, but inaccessible until the player develops sufficient lock-picking ability to open the case, or returns with Dogmeat, who can retrieve it regardless of lock difficulty. It fires a stream of cryogenic coolant that freezes enemies, slowing their movement and eventually shattering them if they are reduced to very low health while frozen. The cryolator is one of Fallout 4's most distinctive non-combat experiences because of its placement. It is the first thing many players see that they cannot immediately have, establishing a desire that must be deferred and eventually fulfilled. The cryogenic technology that the cryolator employs connects to Vault 111's specific character as a facility designed for cryogenic preservation. The player's character spent 200 years frozen in its pods. And the cryolator's liquid nitrogen-based ammunition is a modification of the same technology that preserved them. There is something appropriate about a survivor emerging from Vault 111, eventually acquiring a weapon built on the principles of that vault's primary technology, converting the mechanism of their preservation into a tool for their continued survival. The connection is probably not emphasized enough in the game's text to constitute deliberate storytelling, but players who notice it find it satisfying regardless. The cryolator's ice-shattering execution effect is among the most visually extreme in the base game, reserved for enemies who are both sufficiently frozen and sufficiently low on health to trigger it. Players who built characters around the cryolator often invested in ways to rapidly lower enemy health once the freezing effect was established, converting the freeze from a slowing debuff into a reliable execution setup. A two-stage combat approach that required different thinking than the single-stage solution that most weapons offered. That distinctive tactical flavor is part of what makes the cryolator a weapon people remember rather than simply use. The gamma gun is a unique weapon to Fallout 4, designed to fire concentrated bursts of gamma radiation, the most penetrating form of ionizing radiation in the game's physics, dealing radiation damage that reduces maximum health rather than current health, a form of harm that operates differently from conventional damage and interacts specifically with the game's radiation biology. Against human enemies, the gamma gun is exceptionally effective. Against ghouls, who are already highly irradiated, it has essentially no effect. Against robots and other non-biological targets, it deals no radiation damage at all. The gamma gun is a weapon that requires you to know your target, which makes it a weapon that rewards knowledge. The radiation mechanics underlying the gamma gun's design reflect one of Fallout's consistent themes, that the post-nuclear world has altered the fundamental biology of its inhabitants in ways that require altered thinking about every aspect of survival. Radiation is not simply a hazard to be avoided in Fallout. It is a pervasive condition, a defining feature of the world's new ecology, a force that has created new forms of life and transformed the existing ones. The gamma gun takes that pervasive condition and makes it a weapon, converting the world's fundamental alteration into something that can be directed. In doing so, it achieves a particular kind of Fallout elegance, using the world's disaster as a tool for navigating the world's consequences. The deathclaw gauntlet A melee weapon constructed from the severed hand of a deathclaw is less a weapon and more a philosophical statement. Deathclaws are among Fallout's most formidable and feared creatures. Large, fast, heavily armored predators with exceptional senses and the ability to kill most survivors in a small number of attacks. Building a weapon from a deathclaw's hand requires first surviving an encounter with one long enough to retrieve the relevant component, which itself represents a significant accomplishment. Wearing the resulting gauntlet is a statement about that accomplishment, carried forward into every subsequent encounter as a visible piece of evidence. The Deathclaw Gauntlet appears in several Fallout games and has been consistently associated with characters who chose to build melee-focused characters willing to engage with Fallout's most dangerous enemies in the manner that made them most dangerous. It deals slashing damage that bypasses some portion of enemy damage reduction, reflecting the Deathclaw's own claw's ability to penetrate the armor of their prey, and it extends the range of a punch slightly, enough to matter in the close quarters combat that melee builds necessarily inhabit. The weapon does not try to be subtle. Its entire identity is that it comes from something terrifying and now serves someone brave enough to face that thing. The crafting recipe for the Deathclaw Gauntlet in Fallout 4 includes only the Deathclaw hand and a single other component, a leather belt used to strap the hand to the player's fist. The simplicity of the recipe is itself a form of honesty. The weapon's power comes from the Deathclaw, not from any manufacturing sophistication applied to it. All a survivor needed to do was survive the Deathclaw, attach its hand to their own with a leather belt, and walk forward with it. That directness is Fallout at its most fundamental. The world is terrifying, and the things that survive it long enough to walk forward carry the marks of what they've faced. The Incendiary shotgun found in Fallout 76's scorched regions represents one of the game's more satisfying convergences of visual design and practical function. It fires shells packed with incendiary material rather than standard buckshot, leaving patches of burning ground on impact and dealing fire damage that accumulates over time on targets that remain within the burning area. In Appalachia's dense forests and collapsed industrial facilities, where close-range combat happens constantly and repositioning opportunities are limited, a weapon that controls territory through fire, rather than simply damaging whatever it hits, occupies a specific tactical role that other weapons cannot fill. Players who learn to use the burning ground strategically, moving enemies into it rather than following enemies out of it, found in the Incendiary shotgun a tool that rewarded spatial thinking more than reaction speed. The Scorchbeast-derived weapons that appear in Fallout 76's late-game content represent the endpoint of the series' tradition of extracting weapons from the creatures of the wasteland, taken to its logical extreme. The Scorchbeast is Fallout 76's most fearsome native creature, a massive flying predator capable of spreading the scorched plague, the central threat of the game's setting, and weapons built from its bones and membrane carry the specific gravity of having been made from something genuinely dangerous. The Scorchbeast bone saw the membrane-stretched weaponry. These items exist at the far edge of what wasteland engineering can accomplish, built by survivors who have defeated something almost impossible to defeat and chosen to commemorate that victory in the most Fallout manner available, by making it useful. The radium rifle appears in Far Harbor's content alongside the lever action and harpoon gun, chambered in a conventional ballistic caliber, but with a core that has been treated to deliver radiation damage alongside its conventional impact. The weapon was designed as a tool for the Children of Atom, the religious faction that worships nuclear radiation as a divine force and occupies significant portions of the Far Harbor Island. For the Children of Atom, a weapon that delivers radiation damage is not simply a practical choice. It is a theological one, a means of spreading what they believe to be a sacred transformative force. The radium rifle is therefore one of Fallout's clearest examples of a weapon as ideological expression, its mechanical design inseparable from the worldview of the community that created and carried it. The The Children of Adam provide some of Fallout's most interesting lore around weapon culture. The idea that a community could develop a specific tool philosophy around their fundamental beliefs. That the wasteland's extraordinary conditions had produced not just new forms of life, but new forms of meaning attached to those conditions. The radium rifle carried by a child of Adam is not a weapon in the same sense that a settler's hunting rifle is a weapon. It is a form of devotion made portable, a small piece of a cosmology expressed in metal and radioactive material, carried into encounters with the confidence of someone who believes their cause is literally holy. The syringer is perhaps Fallout 4's most unusual ranged weapon, a pneumatically powered syringe launcher that fires modified medical syringes containing various chemical compounds, each with a different effect on whatever they hit. The base syringer fires paralyzing agents, but modifications through the weapons workbench open up a range of chemical payloads. Berserker's serum that makes enemies attack their allies, bleed out serum that deals damage over time, lock joint serum that freezes movement, and several others. The syringer is not a weapon for dealing direct damage in any conventional sense. It is a control weapon designed to reshape the dynamics of an encounter by altering the behavior and condition of enemies rather than simply reducing their capacity to continue. The Syringer's design implies a specific pre-war context, military or law enforcement applications where incapacitation was preferable to lethal force, and where chemical agents delivered accurately at range were the appropriate tool for that preference. In the post-war wasteland, those law enforcement applications have dissolved along with the laws they enforced, but the Syringer persists as a tool for survivors who prefer to manage encounters rather than simply end them. Characters who see combat as a problem to be solved with multiple available solutions rather than a situation requiring maximum force output. The Berserker's serum modification, in particular, produces memorable results in enclosed areas with multiple enemies. Firing it into a group and stepping back while the affected enemy turns on their allies creates a tactical situation that the Syringer's user did not create through force, but through chemistry, through the application of knowledge rather than aggression. This approach to combat is one that Fallout's non-lethal and stealth systems have consistently rewarded, and the syringer represents its clearest expression in the form of a dedicated weapon. A gun whose most interesting ammunition turns your enemy's capacity for violence against each other rather than directing that violence toward them from outside. The shredder modification for the minigun in Fallout 4 deserves specific mention because it represents something the game rarely offers. A modification that completely transforms a weapon's fundamental role. The shredder replaces the minigun's rotating barrels with a spinning blade assembly, converting it from a ranged weapon into a melee weapon. A close-range spinning blade driven by the same motor that normally rotates the barrels for conventional fire. The result is a minigun used as a power tool against adjacent enemies, dealing melee damage while producing the same motor sound as the ranged version. The shredder modification is one of Fallout 4's clearest expressions of the crafting system's creative potential. The idea that weapons are not fixed in their roles, but are platforms for experimentation. That the distinction between a ranged and a melee weapon is a function of configuration rather than fundamental character. A minigun modified with the shredder is a minigun in mechanical terms. Same motor, same housing, same weight. But it is doing something completely different with those components. This kind of creative conversion echoes the broader wasteland philosophy that objects are defined by their application rather than their original purpose, that resourceful people see potential where less imaginative ones see fixed functions. Players who discovered the shredder modification often reacted with the specific delight reserved for Fallout's best surprises. The realization that something they thought they understood had revealed a dimension they had not anticipated. That delight, the discovery that the world contains more options than you had assumed, is one of the experiences the Fallout series has consistently worked to produce, and the shredder modification achieves it in a single crafting table interaction. The pipe weapons introduced in Fallout 4 as the Commonwealth's most basic tier of firearms represent something the earlier games handled through the general concept of condition rather than through specific weapon categories. Pipe guns, the pipe pistol, pipe rifle, pipe revolver, and their variants are weapons assembled by survivors with limited resources and limited manufacturing sophistication from plumbing components and basic mechanical parts. They are the baseline, the floor below which weapon quality does not go, the answer to the question of what people carry when they cannot find or afford anything better. The pipe weapons carry their improvised character openly. They look like someone made them because they needed a gun and had pipes available, which is exactly what happened. The welds are visible. The wooden components are unfinished. The barrels and stocks are assembled from clearly repurposed materials rather than purpose-made components. In a game filled with polished pre-war manufacturing and Brotherhood of Steel military hardware, the pipe weapons serve as a constant reminder that the Commonwealth's baseline is improvisation, that the vast majority of its inhabitants make do with materials rather than acquiring tools. This contrast between improvised and manufactured is one of Fallout 4's more consistent visual arguments about the Commonwealth's social stratification. Raiders carry pipe weapons. Minutemen recruits carry pipe weapons. The people who carry pre-war rifles and pistols, or Institute weapons, or Brotherhood military hardware occupy different positions in the post-war hierarchy, and their equipment communicates that position before a word is spoken. The pipe weapons are not simply a low-tier game mechanic. They are a visual language for economic reality in a world without economies, the materialization of how little most people have. The dart gun from Fallout 3 is a craftable weapon that fires modified darts capable of crippling an enemy's legs on impact, dramatically reducing their movement speed and effectively converting a threat into a more manageable problem through targeted harm rather than lethal force. Its components include a toy car, a paint gun, a surgical tubing, and a rad scorpion poison gland, assembled into a configuration that uses the paint gun's pressure mechanism to propel venom-laden darts with enough accuracy to hit specific body parts at short range. The dart gun is a craftsman's weapon, a tool for people who have thought carefully about the tactical problems they face and designed a specific solution for a specific problem. The rad scorpion poison gland at the heart of the dart gun's design requires first harvesting it from a rad scorpion, the large irradiated scorpions that populate the capital wasteland and attack with both their claws and a venomous stinger. The dart gun uses that venom not to kill but to incapacitate, applying the rad scorpion's own biological weapon in a modified form to opponents who are significantly larger and more dangerous than the creatures the rad scorpion would normally hunt. There is something characteristic of Fallout's design thinking in this, the conversion of a predator's specialized weapon into a human tool, the application of the wasteland's biology to the problems the wasteland creates, the feedback loop of adaptation that defines survival in a world altered beyond recognition. The Deliverer, mentioned briefly in the context of the Railroad faction, merits its own sustained attention because its history within Fallout 4's fiction is unusually complete. The Deliverer is given to the player by the Railroad's most capable operative, a mysterious figure called Deacon, as part of joining that organization. It is a gift of trust and initiation, an object passed from an experienced survivor to a new one with the expectation that the new one is capable of using it. The Deliverer is described in the game's flavor text as having a history of changing hands among Railroad operatives, each one passing it to someone they trusted when the time came. The Deliverer's mechanical characteristics suit the Railroad's operational philosophy. It is a silenced pistol with high accuracy and low action point cost in VATS, designed for quiet, precise engagement rather than open combat. The Railroad works in secrecy, moving synthetic humans along covert routes through the Commonwealth, avoiding confrontation when possible, and resolving unavoidable encounters as quietly as the situation allows. The Deliverer is the ideal tool for this approach, a weapon that leaves the smallest possible footprint, that is carried and used as a last resort rather than a first, that preserves the possibility of continued secrecy even when things go wrong. The name itself carries the same quiet weight as the weapon's history. A deliverer delivers things: people, messages, freedom. The railroad's mission is delivery in precisely this sense, moving synthetic humans from captivity to safety, delivering them from one condition to another across a hostile landscape. The weapon named for this mission carries the mission's meaning in its very designation, a small piece of writing that rewards the attention of anyone who pauses to consider what a gun called the Deliverer is delivering, and for whom. The Old Faithful laser pistol is a unique weapon in Fallout 4 acquired through Diamond City's general merchant, a trader who stocks an inconsistent but sometimes remarkable inventory of useful items. Its legendary effect doubles damage output when the target is at full health, an effect called instigating in the game's mechanical language, meaning that it deals exceptional damage on the first shot of any engagement, but returns to standard performance for subsequent shots. The Old Faithful rewards precision and planning, knowing where enemies will be before they see you, arranging the conditions for that critical first contact, treating combat as a sequence of managed moments rather than a continuous engagement. The name Old Faithful connects to the famous geyser in what was once Yellowstone National Park, a geyser notable for the reliability of its eruption schedule, for being the kind of natural phenomenon that people could plan around and trust. Naming a laser pistol for a reliable natural wonder in a world where reliability has become extraordinarily rare says something specific about what the weapon represents to whoever gave it that designation. Something that behaves consistently, that can be counted on to perform at the moment it is needed, is in the Fallout wasteland a kind of miracle, and a laser pistol that deals its highest damage when it matters most, on the first shot when everything is still uncertain, earns a name that acknowledges its specific dependability. The Last Minute is a unique Gauss rifle in Fallout 4, associated with the Minutemen faction and sold by Ronnie Shaw, the tough former Minutemen soldier who appears at the castle after that location has been reclaimed. It carries a wounding legendary effect, dealing bleeding damage over time in addition to its primary Gauss damage, and its name represents both the Minutemen's tradition and a kind of wry acknowledgement of the situations that made the weapon necessary. The Last Minute is the weapon of people who had to fight at the last possible moment to preserve something worth preserving, who built their identity around the idea that it was never too late to stand and defend a community. The Minutemen's weapons culture across Fallout 4 reflects their identity more broadly: practical, accessible, maintained rather than new, built from what was available rather than what was ideal. The Last Minute's Gauss mechanism and wounding effect represent an exception to this general character, a weapon of exceptional quality in the hands of an organization that generally made do with less, and Ronnie Shaw's presence as its vendor makes that exception meaningful. Shaw is a survivor who represents the Minutemen at their most capable and most committed, someone who kept fighting when the organization dissolved and returned to help rebuild it. The Last Minute in her inventory is the weapon of someone who held on. The assault rifle in Fallout 4 occupies a curious position in the Commonwealth's landscape of available weapons. It does not carry the intimate history of the 10mm pistol or the cultural weight of the hunting rifle. It is simply the most recognizable intermediate caliber automatic rifle in the game, a belt-fed weapon with a rotating barrel cooling system, visually inspired by light machine gun designs of the mid-20th century rather than the assault rifle configurations most players might expect from the name. This discrepancy between name and form generated considerable conversation among Fallout's community when the game launched, with longtime fans noting that the weapon looked more like a squad automatic weapon than the assault rifles they remembered from earlier entries in the series. The assault rifle's visual design in Fallout 4 reflects the game's broader tendency to reinterpret familiar categories through the lens of its alternate history aesthetic. In the world Bethesda built, weapons development followed different paths. Vacuum tube technology persisted where transistors never miniaturized, and the industrial design language of the 1950s permeated everything from household appliances to battlefield hardware. The assault rifle in this context is not designed to look like a modern military weapon. It is designed to look like what a 1950s engineer, working within that alternate technological framework, would have conceived as the appropriate tool for suppressive automatic fire at medium range. The result is distinctive precisely because it defies the comparison to contemporary firearms that a more conventional design would invite. Mechanically, the assault rifle in Fallout 4 fills the automatic fire role that players who preferred a sustained rate of fire over precision tended to gravitate toward in the mid-game. It accepts a substantial range of modifications through the weapons workbench, including different barrel lengths, stock configurations, and magazine sizes that allowed players to tune its behavior toward either accuracy or volume of fire. Players who built characters around the assault rifle often extended barrel length significantly, which improved accuracy enough to make it competitive at ranges slightly beyond where automatic fire typically operates effectively. That combination, the visual identity of a heavy weapon and the behavior of something more precise, gave the assault rifle a character that extended beyond its name's implications. The ammunition economy of the assault rifle, chambered in 5.56 millimeters, connected it to the combat rifle, a semi-automatic weapon in the same caliber that offered greater accuracy per shot at the cost of fire rate. Players who carried both could maintain the same ammunition supply for both weapons, giving their loadout a flexibility that single-caliber builds enabled. This interchangeability was a deliberate design choice that encouraged players to think of their weapon selection as a system rather than a collection of individual choices, each weapon complementing the others rather than competing for resources. The combat rifle in Fallout 4 is the assault rifle's careful, measured counterpart, a semi-automatic weapon in the same 5.56 caliber that prioritizes accuracy over rate of fire. Designed for survivors who prefer to place each shot with intention rather than relying on the cumulative weight of automatic fire. Its silhouette suggests an intermediate between a hunting rifle and a military carbine. Visually positioned in the space between civilian and military applications in a way that suits the Commonwealth's general population, a weapon that could belong to a serious scavenger or a well-supplied raider with equal plausibility. The combat rifle's modification options overlap significantly with the assault rifle, reflecting their shared caliber and general design philosophy. The same barrel length supply, the same stock configurations, many of the same receiver modifications. Players who built around the combat rifle found themselves navigating a modification tree that felt comprehensively designed. There were no obvious gaps in its options, no configurations that felt like they were missing a natural counterpart. This completeness gave the weapon a satisfying quality as a crafting project independent of its performance in encounters, the experience of working with a system that had been thought through carefully. Among the combat rifle's most significant modifications is the automatic receiver upgrade, which converts it from semi-automatic to full automatic fire at the cost of accuracy and increased ammunition consumption. This conversion option sits at the heart of one of Fallout 4's recurring design decisions, the question of whether to specialize a weapon or maintain its flexibility. A combat rifle converted to automatic becomes a variant assault rifle, trading its accuracy advantage for the volume of fire advantage of the other category. The choice to convert or not is itself a form of character expression, a small statement about the kind of survivor you are trying to build and the kind of wasteland you are trying to navigate. The submachine gun in Fallout 4 extends the automatic weapon family into a specifically close-range configuration, a compact weapon firing 45 caliber automatic cartridges at high rate, designed for the urban environments of the Commonwealth where engagement distances tend to be short, and the ability to deliver many rounds quickly matters more than the ability to reach distant targets. Its design aesthetic follows the Tommy gun tradition of the 1920s and 30s, another piece of Fallout's tendency to find its visual language in specific historical periods and extrapolate them through an alternate history lens. The 45 caliber automatic cartridge the submachine gun fires is shared with the 45 auto pistol, a single-shot handgun configuration using the same ammunition that offers better accuracy per shot for players who prefer slower, more deliberate fire. This ammunition sharing relationship gives submachine gun builds a sidearm option that does not require maintaining a separate caliber, simplifying the resource management that sustained automatic fire demands. Players who built around the submachine gun often carried the 45 auto as their transition weapon for encounters where the submachine gun's volume of fire was excessive, where a quieter, more precise response would serve better than the submachine gun's characteristically enthusiastic approach. The submachine gun's compact size and high rate of fire made it a natural choice for survival gameplay on higher difficulty settings, where the ability to deliver maximum damage in minimum time before retreating to cover determined outcomes more than careful marksmanship. Players who learned to use cover actively, moving between positions, managing the exposure time of each engagement, treating the wasteland's ruined architecture as a resource rather than a backdrop, found in the submachine gun a weapon that matched their approach. It did not ask for patience or distance, it asked for movement and opportunity. The pipe bolt action in Fallout 4 represents a specific tier of improvised sniping capability, a single-shot bolt-action weapon assembled from pipe components that fires a heavy caliber round at ranges its construction should not support, but demonstrably does. It is the long-range representative of the pipe weapon family, extending that family's improvised philosophy into a domain usually reserved for precision-manufactured hardware. A statement that even the Commonwealth's most resource-limited survivors could develop a relationship with distance if they needed to. The bolt-action mechanism is, mechanically speaking, among the most reliable designs in conventional firearms history. By manually cycling a new round into the chamber after each shot, the bolt action eliminates the mechanical complexity of semi-automatic cycling, reducing the number of components that can fail and the sensitivity to ammunition variations that can interrupt automatic feeding. In a wasteland where manufacturing tolerances are maintained through improvised repair rather than factory quality control, the bolt-action simplicity is a genuine advantage, a design that continues to function reliably in conditions that would interrupt more sophisticated systems. Players who invested modifications into the pipe bolt action often found it performing comparably to dedicated sniper rifles at the ranges where the Commonwealth's encounters typically occurred, which surprised those who had dismissed it as a low-tier starting weapon. The gap between the pipe bolt action at full modification and a conventional sniper rifle was measurable, but not as large as the visual distinction between them suggested. And discovering this gap empirically, by building the weapon and testing it, rather than relying on preformed assumptions, was one of Fallout 4's quieter satisfactions. The wasteland rewards people who test their assumptions against experience. The double-barrel shotgun in Fallout 4 returns to one of the most elemental shotgun configurations in firearms history. 2 barrels, 2 shells, a break-action mechanism for reloading, and no mechanical complexity beyond what those elements require. It fires both barrels simultaneously, delivering a tremendous volume of shot at close range in a single trigger pull, followed by the requirement to break the action and reload before firing again. This reload is slower than every other shotgun in the game, but the initial delivery of double shot more than compensates at the ranges where the double barrel is most effective. The double barrel shotgun's pre-war history in Fallout's world would have been as a hunting implement and home defense weapon, exactly the roles it serves in real-world history. Its survival into the post-war wasteland is consistent with the survivability of mechanically simple designs generally. Fewer components means fewer points of failure, and a weapon that can be maintained with basic tools and minimal expertise tends to outlast its more sophisticated contemporaries, in conditions without formal maintenance infrastructure. The double barrel found across the Commonwealth is almost certainly centuries old in most cases, its original finish worn away and replaced through multiple generations of repair and improvisation, but its fundamental operating mechanism unchanged from the factory. The double barrel shotgun's place in Fallout 4's community of players was somewhat unconventional. It was rarely discussed as an optimal choice, but it maintained a devoted following among players who valued the experience of using it over the efficiency that other weapons offered. The double shot delivered an immediate satisfaction that semi-automatic shotguns could not replicate, a single moment of concentrated force that ended encounters in a way that felt different from the sustained application of other weapons. Players who carried the double barrel understood that they had chosen sensation as much as function, which is itself a legitimate reason to carry a weapon through the wasteland. The lever-action shotgun that appears in Fallout 76's Appalachian landscape extends the lever-action tradition into the shotgun category, in a configuration with genuine historical precedent. Lever-action shotguns were manufactured in the late 19th century and found use in environments where a faster follow-up shot than a break action provided was desirable, but the mechanical complexity of a pump action was a concern. In Appalachia, with its dense forests and close encounter wildlife, the lever-action shotgun fits the environment with the same logic that made the historical version attractive. It cycles quickly enough for follow-up shots, without requiring the two-handed pumping motion that takes attention away from target tracking. Fallout 76's Appalachian setting gave its weapons a specific regional character that the game's designers clearly thought about carefully. The lever-action series, the lever gun, the lever-action shotgun, belong to a tradition of American mountain and frontier weaponry that suits West Virginia's history and geography, in ways that would not suit Boston or Las Vegas, or the capital's ruins. This regional weapon identity is one of the things that makes each Fallout game's world feel specifically inhabited rather than generically post-apocalyptic. The sense that the weapons available in a place are the weapons that would have been available in that place, maintained and improvised, and passed through generations of survivors who never left the region their ancestors knew. The lever-action shotgun's modification options in Fallout 76 reflected the game's expanded crafting system, which offered more granular control over weapon performance than Fallout 4's already extensive options. Players could tune the lever-action shotgun's choke configuration to affect shot spread, adjust the stock for carry weight versus stability, and select barrel lengths that changed the weapon's effective range profile. These options made the weapon feel responsive to the player's approach in a way that compensated for its unconventional mechanism. A gun that behaved differently than expected and rewarded the investment of modification time with a performance genuinely suited to the specific survivor carrying it. The hunting bow and the compound bow in Fallout 76 represent the furthest point from pre-war technology that Fallout's weapons have reached in the mainline series. Weapons with no electronic components, no manufactured propellant, no supply chain dependencies, beyond the ability to find or make appropriate arrows. The bow is Fallout's most ancient weapon, connected not to the series' pre-war technology, but to a human past before gunpowder, before industry, before the specific chain of developments that led to the world of Fallout's lore. In Appalachia, where the collapse of civilization's infrastructure was particularly complete, survivors who learned to use bows accessed a self-sufficiency that no other ranged weapon could offer. The arrows that bows fire in Fallout 76 can be crafted from basic materials, wood for the shaft, feathers for fletching, metal for the head, and many arrow variants can be produced with specific chemical coatings or head designs that add different damage types on impact. Poison arrows, fire arrows, explosive arrows. The compound bow's arrow variety gives it a flexibility in dealing with different enemy types that its simple mechanism might not suggest. This variety transforms the bow from a primitive fallback into a sophisticated tactical tool for survivors who invest in understanding it. which is exactly the kind of reward for investigation that Fallout's best weapon systems provide. The compound bow offers additional draw weight and therefore greater arrow velocity and damage compared to the hunting bow at the cost of the compound mechanism's additional complexity. In Fallout 76's survival context, that complexity trade-off becomes meaningful. A compound bow is more powerful but requires more specific maintenance knowledge and more precise component care than a simple recurve hunting bow. Players who chose the compound bow were committing to a relationship with a more demanding tool, accepting the responsibility of its additional needs in exchange for its additional capability. That calculus is one that Fallout survival systems have always asked players to make, and the bow system extends it into territory the earlier games never fully explored. The alien atomizer and related alien weapons that appear in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta downloadable content occupy a fascinating category. Weapons so technologically advanced that their operating principles are not fully explained within the game, leaving players to observe their effects and infer their mechanisms from the outcomes rather than any provided documentation. The alien atomizer fires a beam of blue energy that deals damage through a mechanism distinct from both conventional laser and plasma weapons. It is not a coherent light beam, not superheated matter, but something unnamed and categorically outside the wasteland's established technological vocabulary. The alien weapons in Mothership Zeta are generally more powerful than their terrestrial counterparts on a per-shot basis, but they share the limitation of requiring alien power cells, ammunition that cannot be produced by the player, purchased from conventional vendors, or found reliably anywhere other than the Zeta location itself. This scarcity converts the alien weapons from straightforward upgrades into decisions about resource management, the understanding that carrying one means accepting a finite supply that cannot be replenished through the usual methods. Players who brought alien weapons back to the capital wasteland were carrying a timer as much as a weapon, counting shots rather than using the weapon freely, reserving it for encounters that truly justified its expenditure. The presence of alien technology in Fallout's world has generated extensive community discussion over the years, touching on questions of how it fits within the series' broader lore and what its implications are for the history of the world Fallout depicts. The official answer seems to be that alien visitors were a genuine feature of Fallout's pre-war history, that the Roswell incidents and related events in the game's alternate timeline involved actual contact, and that the technology the aliens left behind or brought with them represents an external input into a world that was otherwise developing along its own specific, alternate historical path. The alien weapons are the material evidence of that contact, objects that exist entirely outside the industrial logic of everything else the wasteland contains. The Gatling laser is a weapon that takes the principles of the minigun, rotating barrels, continuous fire, high ammunition consumption, and applies them to energy weapon technology, producing a device that fires dozens of laser pulses per second in a sustained stream of destructive light. It is one of Fallout's heaviest standard weapons, requiring significant strength to carry effectively and drawing from fusion core power cells that provide substantial but finite ammunition before requiring replacement. The Gatling laser is a sustained engagement weapon, not suited for brief exchanges that end quickly, but ideal for the extended encounters where its sustained fire rate becomes an advantage that momentarily superior single-shot weapons cannot match. The fusion cores that the Gatling laser consumes are the same power cells used to power suits of power armor, which creates an interesting resource tension for players who invest in both systems. Running a Gatling laser depletes the same supply that keeps power armor functional, requiring a choice about resource priority that makes simple answers insufficient. Players who relied on both systems needed to manage their fusion core acquisition carefully, scavenging from generators, purchasing from vendors, planning routes through the wasteland to ensure supply. This resource overlap was probably intentional, the designers recognizing that both systems represented Fallout 4's most significant power investments and that sharing a resource would ensure they competed rather than stacked without friction. The Gatling laser's visual effect, the sustained stream of red or green laser pulses depending on modification, is one of Fallout 4's most visually distinctive experiences when used in darkness or fog. The rapid fire creates something approaching a continuous beam visually, even though it is technically a rapid succession of discrete pulses. And the effect in a darkened interior or in the Commonwealth's characteristic foggy night is striking enough that players who found the weapon sometimes used it in situations where a more measured choice would have been more efficient, simply because the visual experience of using it was worth the ammunition cost. That willingness to accept inefficiency for experience is one of the more human things that games allow, and Fallout's weapon designs have consistently provided opportunities for it. The broadsword and its family of large melee weapons appear across the Fallout series in various configurations, representing the tradition of heavy cutting weapons that predates gunpowder entirely. In Fallout 4, large melee weapons including machetes, swords improvised from power saw blades, and found bladed implements of various origins populate the melee weapon category, with options for survivors who have committed to close-range combat as a philosophy rather than a fallback. The heaviest of these weapons deal enormous damage per strike at the cost of a slow swing speed that leaves the user vulnerable during the animation, requiring either very high health reserves or very good cover management to use safely. The machete in Fallout 4 and Fallout 76 is worth discussing specifically because of its combination of accessibility and effectiveness. It is found early, it is easy to understand, and it remains competitive through modification in ways that make investing in it feel worthwhile. A fully modified machete is not the most powerful melee weapon available in either game, but it is a weapon that players can find early, carry for a long time, and improve gradually in a way that makes the relationship with it feel developmental rather than disposable. Games that allow players to develop relationships with specific weapons through the investment of modification resources tend to create more attachment to individual objects than games where weapons are purely replaced by superior alternatives. And the machete benefits from this dynamic. The board, a simple plank of wood used as a bludgeoning weapon, appears in Fallout 4 with a deadpan honesty about what it is that suits the series' sense of humor, while also serving a genuine game function as the lowest tier of melee weapons. A board with a nail in it is slightly more effective than a board without one. A board with multiple nails and a bladed modification becomes something that the weapon system treats with the same mechanical seriousness as weapons that cost substantially more resources to acquire. This democratic treatment of improvised materials, the recognition that even a piece of wood can be a weapon worth refining, is consistent with Fallout's broader attitude toward the wasteland's available resources. The Ripper's history in Fallout extends back to the original 1997 game in a way that connects the entire series through a shared design language. In that first game, the Ripper was described as a combat knife modified with a vibrating blade mechanism, a motorized component that accelerated the cutting action beyond what the physical strength of the person carrying it could produce. The concept of adding mechanical assistance to a blade is not without real-world precedent. Powered cutting tools exist in industrial contexts, but the Ripper applies that concept in the specific idiom of Fallout's retrofuturism, producing a melee weapon that combines pre-gunpowder simplicity of concept with pre-war technological enhancement. The Ripper's persistence across the entire Fallout series, appearing in the original, in Fallout 2, in New Vegas, and in Fallout 4, gives it a kind of canonical permanence that few non-firearm weapons can claim. It has adapted to each game's combat system while maintaining its essential character, a powered blade that operates at close range with a distinctive buzzing sound and enough mechanical force to make each contact meaningful. Players who built melee characters in any Fallout game and encountered a Ripper recognized it immediately, regardless of which entry in the series they had started with. because the recognition was written into the weapon's design language rather than dependent on any specific incarnation of its statistics. The Stealth Boy is not a weapon in the conventional sense, but its influence on how weapons are used in Fallout makes it inseparable from any comprehensive account of the series' combat objects. The Stealth Boy is a wrist-worn device that generates a personal stealth field, rendering the user near invisible for a limited duration at the cost of the device itself. It is a single-use consumable that produces an effect with profound tactical implications for any playstyle that involves approaching targets before engaging them. In Fallout's world, it is a pre-war military technology developed for infiltration and sabotage operations, the kind of development that a pre-war America in extended conflict with China would have prioritized. The Stealth Boy's design in Fallout 3 presents it as a small cylindrical device worn on the wrist, humming faintly when activated and producing a visual shimmer in the air around the user rather than true invisibility. A small sensory distinction that the games maintain as a way of keeping the effect visible and comprehensible without breaking the game's internal rules about what is and is not perceivable. The shimmer is subtle enough that enemies cannot detect it at distance or without a direct line of sight, but visible enough that a careful observer could notice the air disturbed by the user's passage. This design balance gives the Stealth Boy a quality of elegant imperfection that suits Fallout's general relationship with its technology. Things work, but they work with limitations that require understanding rather than simple application. Fallout 4 integrated Stealth Boy effects into power armor configuration through certain helmet modifications, producing an armor suit capable of generating a sustained stealth field rather than a limited one. This armor-based stealth field changed the tactical calculus significantly. A player in power armor with active stealth capability combined raw physical protection with the concealment usually reserved for lightly equipped sneakers, a combination that few game systems would have made available and that Fallout 4 offered as the reward for investment in both major systems simultaneously. The result was a character build that felt genuinely unlike anything the earlier games had offered, and that specificity is its own form of reward. The prototype medic power armor is a suit of power armor found in Fallout 3 that contains a specific automated medical system. When the player character's health drops below a threshold, the suit automatically administers a Med-X injection, the game's morphine-derived painkiller medication. This functionality makes it simultaneously a weapon and a medical device, a suit of armor that extends its protective function into active intervention rather than purely passive damage reduction. The automated injection system represents a kind of care built into hardware, the pre-war military's attempt to reduce the human cost of putting people in dangerous situations by automating one element of their recovery. The ethical implications of the prototype medic power armor's Med-X injection system are touched on by the game without being fully explored. Med-X is an addictive substance in Fallout systems, and repeated automated administration could theoretically create a dependency in the character wearing the suit. Whether the pre-war designers considered this, whether the addiction risk was an accepted cost of the protective benefit or an oversight in the system's design, is a question the game leaves open. That openness is characteristic of how Fallout handles its most interesting ethical questions, by presenting the facts and declining to resolve them, trusting the player to sit with the ambiguity. The shishkebab's position within Fallout's cultural history merits expansion beyond what the earlier section addressed, because the weapon has become something more than a game item over the course of the series' existence. It appears on official Fallout merchandise. It was reproduced as a prop by the production team for the Fallout television series, and it has been recreated in physical form by members of the game's community who invest considerable time and craft in producing accurate replicas of wasteland weapons. The shishkebab's transition from game item to cultural object happened because its concept is immediately communicable: a flaming sword made from a motorcycle. You can explain it in 7 words, and the person you are talking to will understand both what it is and something fundamental about the world that produced it. The Fallout television series that debuted in 2204 brought renewed attention to the franchise's weapons as physical objects, requiring the production team to build functional-looking props that could be handled by actors in ways that communicated the weapon's character without the benefit of game mechanics to support them. The shishkebab appeared in the series in a form that honored its game counterpart's essential design, while adapting it to the physical requirements of filming: real fire, real metal, real weight. Seeing it handled by a live actor in a physical space confirmed something that the game's players had always understood: that this is a weapon whose premise is so fundamentally sound in the logic of its own world that it translates immediately across every medium. The cultural longevity of the shish kebab also reflects something true about what makes Fallout's weapons iconic as opposed to simply effective. The Gauss rifle is more powerful. The Fat Man is more dramatic. The Deliverer has a richer narrative history. But the shish kebab is the weapon that non-players, encountering descriptions of Fallout's armory for the first time, remember. It holds its place in cultural memory through the economy of its concept, flaming motorcycle sword, and through the specific humor embedded in that concept, the understanding that the person who built it did so because they needed a flaming sword and a motorcycle brake was what they had available. The submachine gun variations across the series demonstrate how a basic concept, compact automatic weapon, close range, high rate of fire, can be reimagined across different games while maintaining its essential identity. In Fallout New Vegas, the submachine gun category included the 9mm variant and the 12.7mm variant, a distinction that created different tactical roles within the same basic format. The 9mm version was lighter, its ammunition more plentiful, its use case oriented toward a sustained fire role where ammunition supply was the primary consideration. The 12.7 variant was heavier in both the weapon itself and its cartridge, dealing substantially more damage per shot at the cost of heavier ammunition and greater weapon weight. The 12.7mm submachine gun in New Vegas carried a specific visual character: heavier, more industrial, less like a conventional compact weapon, and more like a scaled-down heavy machine gun that communicated its role before any statistics were consulted. Players who encountered it for the first time understood intuitively that this was not a light weapon despite its submachine gun classification, that its compact form was relative rather than absolute, that carrying it required the same kind of commitment that heavier weapons generally demanded. This communication of character through visual design is one of the things Obsidian's design team did consistently well in New Vegas, making each weapon look like what it was before explaining what it was. The assault carbine from Fallout New Vegas represents the assault rifle concept in a lighter, more mobile configuration, chambered in 5mm rather than the heavier calibers used by the marksman carbine or hunting rifle. Its military provenance is explicit in its design. This is a weapon made for soldiers in quantity, to be maintained by armorers in field conditions, to function under circumstances that would compromise more precisely manufactured hardware. In the Mojave, it is found primarily in the hands of NCR soldiers, the Republic's regular infantry, who carried it as their standard-issue rifle and maintained it with the same matter-of-fact professionalism they applied to everything else in their service. The NCR's weapons in New Vegas are specifically designed to communicate the organization's character: standardized, serviceable, maintained to adequate standards rather than exceptional ones. The tools of a democratic institution that had to equip a large fighting force with whatever its industrial base could reliably produce, and its supply lines could reliably deliver. The assault carbine in NCR hands is not a prestigious weapon. It is not a symbol of exceptional individual capability or faction elite status. It is a working weapon in the hands of working soldiers, which makes it, in its own way, one of New Vegas's most honest weapons. A tool that says exactly what it is and asks only that the person carrying it treat it with the basic respect that its continued function requires. The Marksman carbine in Fallout New Vegas sits in the space between the assault carbine and a dedicated sniper platform, chambered in 5.56 and designed for accurate semi-automatic fire at ranges that pure close-range weapons cannot comfortably address. Its design aesthetic borrowed from late 20th century battle rifle configurations, giving it a more contemporary military appearance than many of New Vegas's weapons, which reflected the game's willingness to depict technology that continued developing past the 1950s in certain military contexts, even while consumer technology stagnated in the vacuum tube era. The Marksman carbine's look suggested continuity with real-world military development, a reminder that Fallout's alternate history diverged at specific points rather than generally. The All-American is the unique Marksman carbine available in New Vegas, found in the Vault 34 armory behind an exceptionally demanding lock. Its design added decorative elements, wooden furniture trim, a distinctive barrel assembly that elevated its appearance beyond the standard military issue aesthetic without fundamentally changing its mechanical character. The investment required to acquire it, navigating one of the game's more hostile vaults, defeating its irradiated ghoul population, defeating the lock itself, made finding it feel earned in a way that vendor-purchased weapons could not replicate. The All-American rewarded patience and preparation, which suited the playstyle that the Marksman carbine's accurate semi-automatic design encouraged. The Medicine Stick, a unique large-bore lever-action rifle sold by the Mojave's traveling arms merchant, Samuel at the 188 Trading Post, represents one of New Vegas's most visually distinctive unique weapons. Its barrel is decorated with carved and painted designs that suggest a specific cultural tradition. Native American decorative patterns applied to a firearm, a combination that in the Mojave's specific historical context carries meaning about the communities that shaped the region before the bombs and the communities that rebuilt in the aftermath. The Medicine Stick is not simply a more powerful version of its base weapon. It is an object with a specific cultural history embedded in its surface. Samuel himself is a character whose presence at the trading post suggests a background story the game does not fully tell. A merchant who travels the Mojave with a specific selection of weapons, one of which carries decorative traditions that connect to the region's pre-Columbian and pre-war history. The trading post at 188 is a crossroads in the game's geography, a place where the New Vegas Strip's gravitational pull meets the open Mojave's independence, and Samuel's presence there with the Medicine Stick implies a history of movement and connection across that landscape. Players who purchased the weapon from him carried a small piece of that implied history without the game ever needing to state it explicitly. The sturdy caravan shotgun in Fallout New Vegas belongs to the civilian and commercial economy of the Mojave rather than its military or faction-affiliated weapons traditions. It is a pump-action shotgun found primarily in the hands of caravanners, the merchants and traders who move goods between the Mojave's communities along routes that require armed escorts and reliable personal protection. The caravan shotgun's design reflects this commercial context. It is well maintained in the sense of being serviceable rather than pristine, a working weapon rather than a ceremonial or status-oriented one, built to be used and repaired and used again across countless merchant journeys through contested territory. The caravan economy in New Vegas is one of the game's more fully realized background systems. There are specific caravan companies, specific routes, specific trade goods moving between specific locations, and the caravanners who facilitate this movement are a distinct demographic with their own history in the Mojave. Their weapons are part of that history. The caravan shotgun in the hands of a merchant's guard communicates something specific about the economics of protection in the Mojave, that commercial security is a real need, that the people who provide it use reliable tools rather than status symbols, and that the flow of trade goods through the wasteland depends on ordinary people carrying ordinary weapons with professional commitment. The Dinner Bell, a unique riot shotgun in Fallout New Vegas, is found at the body of a prospector on the cliffs overlooking Jacobstown. Its name carries the particular dark humor of New Vegas's unique weapon naming convention. A dinner bell rings to summon people to a meal, and a shotgun named the dinner bell rings at a register that promises a different kind of arrival entirely. The irony is gentle rather than harsh, a small piece of naming wit that does not require any particular cruelty to appreciate, simply an understanding that language in the wasteland has developed its own flavors of dark and quiet comedy. The riot shotgun category from which the dinner bell derives is one of New Vegas's heavier shotgun configurations, featuring a drum magazine that holds significantly more shells than conventional box magazines, semi-automatic fire, and a weight that commits the character carrying it to the role rather than treating it as an occasional tool. Players who built around the riot shotgun accepted its weight and committed to its close-range specialization, and those who found the dinner bell found a weapon that improved on the base version in exactly the ways that close-range dedicated players wanted improved. The drum magazine's visual distinction, the circular profile visible from any angle, made the dinner bell immediately recognizable as something worth carrying differently than its predecessors. The Compliance Regulator is a weapon from Fallout 4's Far Harbor downloadable content that fires electrical pulses capable of temporarily incapacitating synthetic humans. Specifically, it is designed to affect the synthetic beings called synths, whose electronic nervous systems are vulnerable to targeted electrical discharge in ways that biological nervous systems are not. The Compliance Regulator is a tool developed for a specific purpose in a specific context: the suppression and control of synths, a tool of the Institute's authority over its created beings. Finding one in Far Harbor, far from the Institute's base of operations, suggests the reach of that authority beyond the borders of the Commonwealth, or the displacement of Institute technology into hands that might use it for very different purposes. The Compliance Regulator's specific effectiveness against synths made it a weapon with a very narrow application to the general wasteland, useful in encounters where synths were involved and essentially irrelevant otherwise. This specificity gives it a character unusual among Fallout's weapons, most of which are designed for general application across the range of threats the wasteland presents. Carrying the Compliance Regulator required knowing when its specificity was an advantage rather than a limitation, a kind of tactical intelligence that the weapon itself demanded of anyone who chose to carry it. It was not a weapon for general survival. It was a weapon for a particular kind of encounter with a particular kind of enemy, carried by someone who expected those encounters and prepared for them specifically. The Zealot's rifle is a weapon associated with the Children of Adam in Far Harbor, a semi-automatic rifle with a distinctive radiation damage component that reflects the faction's theological commitments in exactly the same way that the radium rifle does. Where the radium rifle is the Children's primary weapon, the Zealot's rifle is a variant associated with their most dedicated warriors. The Zealots, who serve as the Children's military force and who carry their weapons as expressions of conviction as much as instruments of survival. The name itself communicates the carrier's relationship to their weapon. This is not something a zealot uses. It is something a zealot is, expressed in metal and radiation. The Far Harbor content's willingness to develop a fully realized weapon culture for the Children of Adam, multiple weapon variants, specific naming conventions, visual designs that communicate faction identity, reflects the downloadable content's generally high quality of world building. The island's communities are distinguished from each other not just by dialogue and quest structure, but by their material culture, the things they make and carry and treat with various degrees of reverence. The Children of Adam's weapons are holy objects in a way that Acadia's weapons and Far Harbor's weapons are not, and the game communicates this through the weapons' names and designs, without needing to state it explicitly. The warglaive that appears in Fallout 76's Steel Rain storyline content represents one of the most recent additions to Fallout's iconic melee weapon catalog. A glaive is a pole weapon with a single-edged blade mounted on a long shaft, a medieval European weapon with a history reaching back at least to the 12th century, used by foot soldiers as an effective counter to cavalry. In Fallout 76's version, the War Glaive is a Brotherhood of Steel weapon that incorporates energy technology into a traditional pole weapon frame, energizing the blade with electrical discharge that adds a second damage component to the physical impact. The result is a weapon that occupies a specific cultural position. The Brotherhood of Steel, an organization that venerates pre-war technology, building a new weapon that deliberately incorporates medieval design language into a modern energy weapon frame. The Brotherhood of Steel's relationship with technology in Fallout has always been complicated by the question of what counts as appropriate technology. They collect and preserve pre-war hardware. But do they develop new technology? And if so, by what principles? The Warglaive suggests an answer that the Brotherhood can develop new weapons when those weapons incorporate approved technological components in service of their protective mission, and that the medieval design language of a glaive is not an obstacle to Brotherhood acceptance, but simply a frame waiting to be fitted with appropriate technology. The War Glaive is both ancient and contemporary, a bridge between the Brotherhood's reverence for certain kinds of expertise and their openness to applying that expertise in service of their mission. The auto axe from Fallout 76's Steel Rain content deserves specific attention as a powered melee weapon that extends the Ripper's design philosophy into a larger and more imposing form. Where the Ripper applies a motorized blade to a knife-sized frame, the auto axe applies the same motor concept to an axe head, producing a weapon that swings with mechanical assistance and connects with the full weight of both the axe head and the motor's additional force. Its visual design is imposing in a way that the compact Ripper's is not. The auto axe announces its presence before contact, communicating through its size alone the kind of encounter it represents. The auto axe's introduction through the Steel Rain storyline gave it a specific narrative context. It is associated with the conflict surrounding the Brotherhood of Steel's internal politics during that period, and finding or acquiring one through that content makes it carry the specific weight of those events. Weapons acquired through specific quest lines in Fallout games often carry this additional narrative weight. They are not just tools found in the world, but tools that exist within a story, whose acquisition was itself an event rather than a discovery. The auto axe's players remember not just using it, but the circumstances in which they obtained it, which is one of the ways that narrative-connected weapons achieve a depth of memorability that randomly found items cannot reach. The Grognak's axe in Fallout 4 is a unique weapon associated with the in-universe character Grognak the Barbarian, a pulp fiction hero from Fallout's pre-war popular culture. A Conan-inspired warrior from a serialized adventure comic and paperback novel series that millions of pre-war readers enjoyed. Grognak's axe is literally the weapon depicted in the Grognak the Barbarian comics and novels, a massive two-handed war axe that deals enormous damage and carries legendary effects associated with staggering enemies on impact. It is a weapon from a fictional universe within Fallout's fictional universe, which gives it a specific kind of layered unreality. A fantasy weapon, brought into a post-apocalyptic reality by someone who loved the character it came from. The Grognak collectibles in Fallout 4, the comics that boost unarmed and melee combat ability, the costumes, the action figures, create a picture of pre-war American popular culture in which pulp fantasy was as beloved and pervasive as pulp science fiction. Grognak the Barbarian was, in the pre-war world, what Conan the Barbarian was in ours. A character who captured the imagination of readers who wanted adventures in worlds more physically immediate than their own, whose author gave him enough personality to sustain decades of publication and enough physical capability to satisfy readers who valued strength and courage above subtlety. Finding Grognak's axe in a display case in a museum of supernatural history continues that character's tradition in the most direct possible way. It is the hero's weapon. Available now to a different kind of hero, operating in a world that makes Grognak's adventures seem almost tame by comparison. The Bloodletter is a unique melee weapon in Fallout 4's Nuka World downloadable content. A machete-style blade with an elongated design and a legendary effect that causes bleeding damage on successful hits. It belongs to the Nuka World Raiders, the three raider gangs who control the abandoned Nuka World amusement park, and its acquisition connects to the specific power dynamics of that location and the choices the player makes within it. Nuka World presented Fallout 4 players with one of the most morally complex option sets in the game: the choice to lead the raiders, to undermine them, or to eliminate them entirely, each path with its own weapon rewards and its own narrative consequences. The Bloodletter's design fits Nuka World's aesthetic of retrofuturism mixed with raider improvisation. The abandoned park's infrastructure provided raw materials that the raider gangs converted into both habitation and equipment, and the Bloodletter represents the most capable version of that conversion. It is a weapon that could only exist in this specific place, built from this specific environment, by people with this specific relationship to violence and territory. That groundedness in place and culture is one of the qualities that distinguishes Fallout's best unique weapons from generic stat improvements. The sense that the weapon tells you something about where you are and who was there before you. The Thirst Zapper in Fallout 4's Nuka World content is perhaps the most whimsical weapon in the entire Fallout 4 experience. A water pistol that has been modified to fire various Nuka-Cola formulas as both conventional and energy damage, depending on which flavor is loaded. It begins as a toy, a plastic water gun manufactured before the bombs as a children's amusement item, and ends as a functional weapon through the same principle that the junk jet applies to debris and the dart gun applies to poison glands. The recognition that function follows application, and that a container for liquid can be directed at enemies as easily as at a target painted on a fence. The Thirst Zapper's tonal register is deliberately lighter than most Fallout weapons, acknowledging that Nuka World's entire setting is built on the ruins of what was once a place of joy, an amusement park that existed to make people happy, and that some of the weapons appropriate to that setting should carry a memory of that joy even in their post-war form. The contrast between the toy's original context and its current application is itself a piece of Fallout's characteristic emotional texture. The understanding that the world before the bombs contained beauty and delight, and that the world after the bombs contains the ruins of beauty and delight, and that those ruins are worth dwelling in rather than simply moving past. The Final Judgment is a unique Gatling laser weapon in Fallout 4, associated with Elder Maxon of the Brotherhood of Steel, the faction's leader, found aboard the Prydwen airship that serves as the Brotherhood's mobile base of operations. It is acquired only by defeating Maxon in combat, which requires taking a path through Fallout 4's ending that places the player in direct conflict with the Brotherhood, and this acquisition condition gives it a weight that purely discovered weapons do not carry. The Final Judgment is not found. It is taken from someone who believed in it after defeating them in circumstances where both parties understood the stakes of the encounter. Elder Maxon is one of Fallout 4's most fully realized faction leaders, a young man who rose to command the Brotherhood's Eastern chapter through a combination of genuine capability and the specific accidents of succession that left him in command earlier than any reasonable plan would have predicted. He carries the Final Judgment as a personal weapon rather than a standard issue item, which means it carries his specific history and his specific character in ways that faction standard weapons do not. Taking it from him after defeating him is a form of appropriation that the game does not comment on, but that players feel. The weight of having defeated someone and taken their most personal possession, whatever the justification for that action. It is something simpler that these weapons are remembered. Not all objects in Fallout are remembered. Thousands of items fill the wasteland with no particular distinction, carrying no specific quality that lodges them in the memories of people who encounter them. The weapons discussed here are different. They are remembered because they were experienced, carried through long hours of survival, relied upon in difficult moments, modified and maintained, and eventually lost or replaced with a specific awareness of what was being given up. Memory attaches to objects in Fallout the way it attaches to objects in life, through the context of their use, through the moments when they mattered, through the connection between a specific tool and the specific challenges it helped address. The 10mm pistol is remembered because it was there at the beginning. The hunting rifle is remembered because it carried someone through a long stretch of desert when nothing better was available. The combat shotgun is remembered because of a particular hallway in a particular ruined building where its percussion filled the space completely and the outcome was close enough that remembering it still carries a small residual tension. These objects, these rusted and repaired and carefully maintained instruments of the wasteland, persist across decades of a beloved series because they do what the best objects in fiction do. They carry meaning beyond their function. They are not simply items in an inventory. They are the material record of choices made, of dangers survived, of the specific ways each survivor approached the particular problem of continuing to exist in a world that had not planned for them to do so. They rest now in the quiet of this narration, as they rest in the quiet of every saved game file, patient, purposeful, enduring. The wasteland keeps its weapons. It keeps everything that might be useful, and these weapons, more than useful, have become something closer to familiar. Objects that Fallout's long community of wanderers has carried together through a shared landscape for long enough that their very shapes have become comfortable, their names have become recognizable, their histories have become part of a larger story about what it means to survive something and keep walking forward into whatever comes next. As the night settles deeper and the wasteland grows quieter around these old, enduring things, these rifles and pistols and energy weapons and improvised instruments of survival, what remains is the sense that each of them was more than the sum of its components. The 10mm pistol carried the beginning of every journey through every ruined city and irradiated valley. The hunting rifle carried the patience of people who had learned to wait. The combat shotgun carried the willingness to close distance without hesitation. The fat man carried the specific absurdity of a world that ended in nuclear fire and continued anyway, armed with nuclear fire of its own. These weapons persisted not because the wasteland required them, but because the people who carried them, required the sense of capacity they provided, the feeling of standing within a ruined world with something in their hands that gave them a measure of influence over what happened next. In a world stripped of most of its certainties, a weapon is a small and specific certainty that whatever approaches, there is a response to it, that whatever darkness gathers, there is something that can be directed at it, that no moment of encounter is entirely without options. Fallout's most iconic weapons carry all of this. They carry the stories of the people who made them, the people who first carried them, the survivors who found them centuries later in ruined armories and collapsed vaults, and the dead hands of enemies. They carry the marks of repair and improvisation, the small modifications of people who needed something to work and made it work, the wear of years and use, and the specific kind of devotion that comes from depending on an object for your continued existence. They carry the weight of a world that ended, and the weight of the world that grew up in the aftermath. And tonight, as these stories drift quietly alongside the sound of distant wind through broken windows and the soft glow of a pip-boy screen somewhere in the dark, these weapons rest in the company of the memories attached to them, patient, worn, and enduring as the wasteland itself. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.